speaking of change, something that I think is, I would say, undeniably a sliver of good news is the election in the primary for the New York mayoral race, Zohran Mamdani. A socialist Muslim who's pro-Palestine just won in the most Jewish city in the world outside of Israel. To me, the big deal in that is not just that he describes himself as a democratic socialist, because that's still a big deal, but it's that he's like pro-Palestine and Muslim. I mean, he's a secular guy. It shows that despite the existence of AIPAC, you can run and not be like a pro-Israeli sycophant and win.
I am not confident that local government, mayoral government, can meaningfully improve people's lives in a major city like New York to the point at which it would become some kind of wider model that other people could follow. Just like when AOC won, there were a bunch of people who thought that was a model, and they tried to run those kinds of candidates all over the country. But what happens? Those kinds of candidates, they can win in some places where there's heavily gerrymandered Democratic safe seats, where you're talking about a city that's 60% or more Democrat voting in a presidential election. Sure. Those kinds of candidates can win in places where Democrats and Hillary Clinton are already well-liked. But they don't give you any kind of new possibility for reaching out to people in the parts of the country I'm from and familiar with. And you're not going to get socialists elected in the kinds of states Bernie won in the primaries, in the red states, with this kind of campaign. And did you see the demographics of who he actually won? He didn't win people who don't have college degrees.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with Benjamin Studebaker, one of my favorite guests, friend of the show. You already know, he's been on many times, needs no introduction. And whenever something is happening, or it seems like something might be happening, and there's a lot of complicated analysis and a mixture of narratives that are one-sided, filled with cope, filled with bias, one person I like to see their take on is Studebaker. You have a very astute, sobering analysis, sometimes so sobering that can be very disenchanting, very black-pilling. In fact, it's kind of something that's like associated with you now. You know, the Studebaker pill, the Studebaker black pill, as Dave calls it from Theory Underground. But yeah, we're going to talk about a few things today. One being Israel versus Iran, Zohran. I did not intend for those things to rhyme, but they do. But the election of Zohran Mamdani, who, for mayor of New York, as well as the LA protests, which people, I think, seemingly already probably forgot by now. But that's part of why we waited to even talk about this till now, because with Iran versus Israel, when it was first happening, I was hearing you talk about it on Theory Underground. I was interested. But the thing about events, why I don't cover events and why I hate the idea of being a news channel, most of the time I don't cover contemporary events, if you notice, most of the time. And that's because when you cover news, it's old news as soon as the episode is out. I find it very hard to keep track. And at least I wanted to wait until the fight happens. They exchange a few blows before we analyze what's happening. There was a temporary ceasefire that was supposed to happen, and then Israel broke it, and Trump seems to be very mad at Iran and Israel, especially Israel, in his most recent statement for breaking that. Tell me, what are people missing when it comes to the Iran-Israel conflict as it stands now, particularly the type of people who might listen to this show?
So I think the main thing that sticks out is the asymmetry in what's going on. It is not simply the case that Israel and Iran are lobbing rockets at each other or lobbing drones at each other. Israel is striking in a targeted way, not just specific air defenses, nuclear facilities, things like that, but particular people, specific individuals who play leadership roles in the Iranian military. The message behind what Israel is doing is that the specific individuals who make important decisions for the Iranian regime are not safe, that there's information about where they are, about where they tend to be, and there's a capacity to get at them in those specific locations that they're regularly in. So Israel has created a very insecure environment for high up senior people in the Iranian regime. Iran has not been able to do that in response. Iran has been able to lob enough rockets and drones over the Syrian desert to puncture the Iron Dome and cause some amount of random destruction in Israel. But this is not presenting the same kind of specific threat. It's also not producing the same level of casualties. So if you were to look at it in terms of order of magnitude, the Israeli activity is killing roughly an order of magnitude, so 10 times more people than the Iranian activity. So that's a sharp asymmetry. Now, a lot of the focus recently has been on the U.S. strikes with the big bunker-busting conventional bombs, they're non-nuclear bombs, dropped from the B-2 bombers on the Iranian enrichment sites. And there's dispute about how effective those strikes have been. And this is something that has been debated in the intelligence community for a long time and has occasionally been public. This question about how capable are those conventional bunker busting bombs, because they'd never been used in warfare. They were theoretical. And there was, for a long time, the argument was, how much damage would they actually do? Would you really be able to set back the Iranian nuclear program by any length of time by dropping them? So to have a debate about whether those bombs were effective, that's to be expected. And to have different kinds of claims about how effective they were, yeah, it's going to be hard for us to figure out outside exactly how effective those bombs were. But the thing that I think really matters for the purposes of how this is going to go is not whether the nuclear facilities were destroyed. It's the fear that the Iranian leaders are experiencing as specific individuals whose bodies are in danger. And that produces a different kind of negotiating environment from the environment that existed before Israel demonstrated that it knows where those bodies are and can touch them.
There's a couple of things to touch on. One is this point you made regarding the intelligence that Israel seems to have on the locations, and that's been kind of shown with the execution or with the assassination of the Hamas leader on Iranian soil, which is pretty crazy to think about. And supposedly they used like WhatsApp. That's the kind of narrative I've been hearing. But with the B-2 bomber, right, flying over, from what I understood is that the reason why the U.S. got involved there is because it's really the only bomber capable of actually touching those underground facilities. And Trump is saying that this is the most successful operation ever. Most successful military operation we've ever seen. But I've heard, from what I've heard consistently, is that like at most that this might have set Iran back a few months with their Iran nuclear program. And you made this interesting point on one of your other talks, which is that, or I think it was maybe on Twitter too, but that the U.S. and Iran have kind of different the U.S. and Israel have different objectives when it comes to Iran, in that Israel does want regime change, but the United States, while it does want to calm the nuclear threat, it doesn't necessarily want regime change in Iran in the same way, because there is a huge incentive for America to have the Iranian threat because it can coalesce the oil producing states around America and American interests, like constantly having Iran as a threat in which, like, these countries depend on American support. Tell us about that a bit.
One of the things to notice is how many Arab states helped to defend Israel and how many European states helped to defend Israel. Iran and Russia have a certain function in the American system of creating a proximate threat to allied states in the Middle East and Europe that compels those states to cooperate with the United States. These countries would not be concerned about China on its own. China is very far away from these countries. They trade a lot with China. So as the United States pivots to Asia, the Arab and European countries don't have a lot of incentive to facilitate that pivot by making military expenditures. If, however, you create a connection between China and Russia or between China and Iran, and you say to the Arab and European states, you have to make a contribution to the pivot, because when you're dealing with Iran or you're dealing with Russia, you're actually dealing with China. This can be a way of compelling these countries, which would otherwise be reluctant to devote a lot of resources to strengthening a defense apparatus that's meant to operate in the Pacific Ocean. It can get these countries to cooperate. It can get them to increase military spending. It can get them to increase imports of U.S. weapons substantially. And this is the function that Iran has. So if you were to do regime change in Iran, this would make it potentially harder to get the Arab states to cooperate with each other, to get the Arab states to cooperate with Turkey, to get them to cooperate with Israel. It would reopen questions about how the Middle East is to be managed and governed that are currently put to one side because these various countries all have a concern about Iran and a concern about Iran getting nuclear weapons that disciplines them and keeps them together. So while the United States has to appear committed to preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon so that these countries are committed to helping the United States achieve that goal, kicking this down the road and putting it off indefinitely is kind of functional for the United States because it lengthens this window of time in which Iran is ostensibly trying to get, but never succeeding in getting a nuclear weapon. And during that window of time, all these other countries are worried about Iran and too busy worrying about Iran to worry about each other.
But don't a lot of Republican politicians openly call for a regime change in Iran? Like when they talk about how Iran needs democracy or how, even they should bring back, or that they should bring back the Shah. Often they imply that a lot. And a lot of Iranians in America support that. It's definitely undeniable. Iranians in Canada, it's a phenomenon that they support regime change in Iran depending on when they immigrated from Iran. Is this like, is what you're saying that America, it's not in their interest to have regime change in Iran and to have this threat that they can use to galvanize countries towards the US in a way to kind of facilitate the broader pivot to Asia, and by pivot to Asia, pivot away from China to the rest of Asia, away from China? What do you mean? Like, do you think that this is actually just in the interest, or that just this is actually like a conscious attempt, or is there a split within the Washington policy establishment? Because it does seem to me that like people like Rubio do want regime change in Iran. Nikki Haley, I mean, like, at least in their rhetoric, they make it seem as if that is what they want.
If you could do it very cheaply, if the Americans could do it very cheaply, I'm sure that they would welcome it if the Iranians wanted to get rid of this regime and there was some sort of popular upsurge in Iran and the Iranian military was fragmenting in response to that upsurge. I'm sure the United States would look to very gently push that in the direction that would like to see that go. If you saw a situation similar to Libya or similar to Egypt, where there was a real serious breakdown in the order that allowed potentially some other kind of regime to take shape, I'm sure the United States would be potentially interested in using an occasion like that to put a new regime in Iran. However, if it's going to involve something like Iraq, if it's going to involve something like deployments of troops, long-term commitment, lots of resources, that's very expensive. It won't necessarily work out because the more American commitment there is, that means the less reliable the local population is in taking the lead. And one of the things that the Americans have learned from Iraq is that ideally, the Americans would like to get other populations fighting with American weapons without the Americans having to do much of the fighting. If the Americans are having to do the fighting, what that indicates is that the local population is not willing to do the fighting, that it doesn't care enough about the outcome. And that means when the Americans stop doing the fighting, it's likely that whatever regime the Americans have been supporting will collapse, as we saw in Afghanistan. So that becomes a very expensive money pit, which ultimately doesn't accomplish anything. And in the meantime, there is a function to having this ostensibly menacing, threatening Iran in the region. And that function does have some value to the United States. So when I say that Iran has a function, I'm not saying that because it has this function, the United States is completely disinterested in regime change. But that function does have some value. And a very expensive, costly attempt to change the regime would destroy that function, and it wouldn't necessarily produce a stable alternative in the region. So there's a lot of people in the American security establishment who would be interested in helping, in a minimal way, a popular uprising in Iran, but who would not be interested in trying to do Iraq there.
Iraq as in an invasion.
Iraq is in using American forces to construct the regime, having a regime that relies upon American force to exist. Anything that would involve Americans going through the Zagros Mountains to try to control, particular cities in Iraq, this is very expensive. Part of what I think a lot of the public doesn't understand is that Iran is an incredibly mountainous country with a lot of cities nestled in mountains. And it's incredibly expensive and unpleasant to invade Iran with a land army. It is not something that anybody wants to do. It would be very, very expensive. And there would be no guarantee at the end because the regime that you'd be making would be reliant upon U.S. force to come into existence. There would be no guarantee that the regime that you'd make at the end would actually have any sticking power. So while I'm sure there are plenty of people in the U.S. foreign policy establishment who would do regime change if it were cheap, easy, and driven principally by forces in Iran, I do not see any kind of widespread appetite for expensive, costly regime change with the Americans doing the brunt of the legwork. It's too easy to instead sustain the status quo as a modus vivendi, use Iran as a kind of sheepdog to herd the Arab states and get them to work with Israel, get them to work with Turkey. That seems to me to be the more sensible American strategy and the strategy that is typically defaulted to. Though, of course, the Americans look for opportunities. If there was some kind of big upsurge for the Shah, the Americans would look at that and consider potentially helping with that gently. But I don't see that happening. I don't see any major section of Iranian society that seems prepared to go for something like that, in part because what happened in Libya when there was an upsurge against Gaddafi and the Western states attempted to aid in that upsurge by creating a no-fly zone. Right. So they tried to do it cheap in Libya, and they did do it cheap in terms of cost to the military budgets of the Western states, in terms of cost to the armies. The blood cost was very low for the Western states to do regime change in Libya. But what happened? Because the Western states did not then establish order in Libya because they were committed to doing it cheap, this left a power vacuum in Libya. And in that power vacuum, you got enormous amounts of civil conflict, and the per capita GDP of the country was cut in half. The living standard was cut in half, and the country that had been the richest country in Africa was reduced to an anarchic, incredibly miserable place. So a lot of people in Iran who don't like the Iranian regime nonetheless go, what are the alternatives here? If we have an upsurge and the Americans try to help us with it, we could get Libya. If the Americans come in a bigger, more heavy-handed way to try to make sure that something happens, we could end up like Iraq or Afghanistan. These are not outcomes that we want. While we are not happy, I think many people in Iran are not happy with the regime, the consequences of trying to overthrow the regime and get something else, it's a Pandora's box.
What's important about this is it seems to really highlight one of the discontinuities between Iranian and American imperialist interests, because the differences between America and Israel's interests were much easier to see historically, because America was not always aligned with Israel, and originally was very much not. And it wasn't until really like the War on Terror when you get like this sort of unconditional alliance, this rhetoric of unconditional alliance, our greatest ally, right? But even now, despite AIPAC influence, despite Israel's influence, it's not like Israel like controls America, right? And I think that's this difference, right, in America's unwillingness to do exactly all of what Israel wants shows that. And this difference in interest, I think, highlights something important. Maybe I would elaborate there is with regime change, you mentioned it's costly. It would involve American troops. It'd be unpopular. Be very unpopular in a way that type of thing would not be necessarily unpopular in Israel, probably would be popular. In America, it'd be very unpopular. It's also harder because of all the mountains. But also, like, with the hard thing about regime change is not so much toppling the regime, it's actually installing the one you want to work your way. And America's found out the hard way so many times at this point, with Iraq, with Libya, with Afghanistan, that when you destabilize a country, it doesn't necessarily go in a way that favors American interests. So that would be difficult. Whereas, and that it could, like, if you have a pro-American government in Iran, it would probably be good in some ways for America, but not necessarily. Like, what if it's neither pro-America? What if it's neither pro-America or even anti-Saudi? Kind of changes a lot of issues. It changes a lot of things there. I mean, it probably would be anti-Saudi, just do the Shia Sunni divide, but so it's a kind of bad example. But I think the key thing is for Israel, they don't really care what replaces it. I mean, they would prefer obviously a friendly pro-Israel one, but ultimately I think what Israel would want is a kind of enfeebled Iranian state that allows Israel to expand without having these proxies basically get in its way, like Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, although, the extent to which Hamas relies on Iran, I think is very exaggerated. Like, no one really can get arms in Gaza in the way that you can get arms to like Hezbollah. It's why Hamas is weak as hell. So there's some people try to, I just say that it's obvious to you, but like to some people, like, they think Hamas exists because of Iran or something, which I think is hilarious, ridiculous. But yeah, I mean, that's like the clear thing. Like, Israel doesn't really care if Iran replaces the current Iranian regime, as long as it's weak and can't get in Israel's way. Whereas America, like, sees it as way bigger risk to its own interests. And that's what I think is kind of interesting question.
And we're not just talking about Israel here. The Arab states want to see Iran enfeebled and weakened. The reason that Israel and the United States have become tighter friends is that Israel and the Arab states,
the Gulf states, you mean, like Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia. Yeah. But, also now Israel is able to have peaceful relations with Egypt, whereas, back in the 70s, before the Carter administration, that was not possible. A lot of different states in the Arab world have been able to find common ground with Israel over a shared hostility to Iran. And this is where, if you zoom out a little bit, the Middle East is this broken region because after the old empires in the Middle East collapsed and the mandates were set up, you get these small fragmentary states, each of which understands that
the way to strengthen the Middle East is to create a large political bloc, a big pan-Arab or pan-Islamic state. However, each of the different states has the aspiration to lead that bloc, and they can't all lead it together. And when they've tried to create some kind of federal system, like the United Arab Republic in the 50s, what happens is that the territory that doesn't join those kinds of blocs obstructs and gets in the way of those blocs consolidating. So in the case of the United Arab Republic effort, there was an attempt to establish a federal system led by Egypt, which would include Syria and potentially Libya. But the trouble, of course, is that Israeli territory sits in between Egypt and Syria, which made it very difficult to consolidate the relationship and produced a continuing estrangement between Syria and Egypt, and then a lack of capacity on the part of Egypt to provide security in Syria and to try to deal with rebellious elements within Syria. And so eventually the United Arab Republic broke apart. Egypt, Turkey, and Iran are the three countries in the Middle East that have something approaching 100 million people and a real capacity to lead or anchor a much larger kind of political bloc. But each of these states is continuously frustrated by the small post-colonial states that exist in between, that are often armed to the teeth by the West, and which exist in large part to frustrate any kind of aspiration that any of those three larger players has. So Turkey and Egypt have accommodated themselves to being endemically frustrated. Turkey has joined NATO, Egypt cut a deal, but Turkey and Egypt are constantly mistreated by the West. They're never given EU membership. They're never given the opportunities to economically develop that the European allies get. So there's all sorts of frustration and discontent in Turkey and Egypt with this arrangement. And you see it in Turkey's attempts to negotiate with the Europeans and say, well, you don't let us into the European Union. So what are you going to give us to not allow the refugees from the conflicts in the Middle East to come into the Balkans? Are you going to pay us to do that or not? And the Egyptians go, you want us to provide security in Gaza? You want us to take a displaced population from Gaza? What are you going to give us to deal with that? How are you going to compensate us? These countries have the same core frustrations with the West that the Iranians, of course, also have. The difference is that they have accommodated themselves to some kind of cooperative relationship that is suboptimal for them, but seems to them to be the best that they can get. Iran has tried to persist outside of this system. And its attempt to persist outside of this system has helped the United States to discipline the other states, to discipline Egypt, to discipline Turkey, and of course, to discipline the smaller Arab states in Israel, and to get those states to cooperate. So Iran's non-cooperation provides this continuous reminder of a need to cooperate with the West. And this is the sense in which Iran's attempted rebellion becomes functional and facilitates consolidation of the Western alliance system in the Levant.
I wouldn't call it like controlled opposition, because obviously not controlled opposition, but it's like this phenomenon where it's actually beneficial to have a kind of adversary that, is beneficial to your interests. Like, you don't want them gone. You want them to exist.
And there's this reminder of what happens if economically you are not fully integrated, what happens if economically you try to rebel or resist. It provides this reminder.
Many say that that's Hamas's role for Israel, and that not what they consciously do, but kind of the role they play is that there's a constant reminder, an excuse for Israel to militarize all the time, and it's an excuse for it to bomb Palestine and slowly kill its population, being Hamas as a useful opponent.
This has been the huge question in Gaza. Israel says that it will not leave Gaza as long as the only force that's in Gaza that can potentially provide security after Israel leaves is Hamas. So the continuing presence of Hamas and the lack of presence of any other military force able or willing to provide security in Gaza has given Israel this excuse to stay. The question is anyone else going to come in and provide security there? The PLO doesn't seem to have the capacity to do it. That's in part why Hamas got going there in the first place. The PLO lost substantial public support. And it's not clear that the PLO could, by itself, without help from somebody else, establish order there. Maybe the PLO could be the front man for something, backed by somebody else. But you need somebody else. Who's going to do it? Who's going to put boots on the ground and establish order there other than Israel? That's been the continuing question. And Egypt is the obvious candidate to lead it because it's local, because it has a border. But why should Egypt agree to pay the cost of that? And why would the Egyptian people endorse Egypt helping Israel to get the outcome it desires in Gaza? You can understand why politically it would be very tricky for Egypt to do that, even if Egypt were being well compensated for the work that it's being asked to do. And no one is really willing to pay Egypt what that work is worth.
Yeah, I think that's the point a lot of people don't understand, because I had this conversation with somebody once who said, well, shouldn't we blame the Arab states too? Why don't the Arab states support the Palestinians and their fellow Muslims like the West supports Ukraine? And I'm thinking, well, okay, first off, when we talk about the Arab states, I would definitely agree with that criticism with the Saudis and the Gulf states who are rich and, but the reason why they don't is because they don't want to take anybody who might be potentially like any sort of opposition threat or who isn't disciplined. They want a kind of very disciplined population that won't pose any threat to their monarchies. But in the case of Egypt, which I think there's some element of that even in Egypt, but in Egypt or Jordan or like Lebanon, I think what people forget is that these countries took in huge amounts of refugees already just when Israel was created, like with all of the displacement that happened with the creation of Israel. A ton of refugees from Palestine went to these countries and it already caused tensions there. Like in Lebanon, which is, if any country is going to be more culturally proximate to Palestine, at least in terms of like Levantine culture, it would be Lebanon. But even among Lebanon, there was actually kind of like racism towards Palestinians when there was just huge amounts of refugee camps that created sort of resentment because Lebanon is poor. And when you have like people who are already poor, and then you have like more, you have like refugees, it's easy for those people to be pit against each other. And Egypt's still poor. Like Egypt's not a rich country.
And Egypt's growth was continuously and repeatedly frustrated by the West, deliberately and intentionally, at many points in Egypt's history, dating all the way back to Muhammad Ali, the Khedive, who tried to set up a new state in Egypt as the Ottoman Empire was collapsing. British intervened and destroyed his state and propped up the Ottomans. There would have been a completely different kind of Middle Eastern map if Muhammad Ali had been permitted to go through with that. You would have a large Egyptian state that would have a substantial amount of territory in the Levant, would have been a very different kind of Middle East. But that was prevented, and then Egypt was subjected to colonization. And so Egypt has way more people than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's got an air force, and Saudi Arabia buys a lot of American weapons. So Saudi Arabia has a lot of aerial capability, and it can bomb and airstrike Yemen. But Saudi Arabia has a quite low population, especially of proper citizens, because a lot of the Saudi population is a foreign slave labor. So the state that really has the personnel capacity, the very large, useful population in the area is Egypt. Precisely because of all the things that have been done to stifle Egypt, to stifle Turkey, there isn't a state that is rich enough to do this without serious compensation. And the Europeans and the Americans are always looking to get things from Turkey and Egypt without having to pay.
Yeah, and that's another interesting player in this whole arrangement is Turkey, because rhetorically they are super anti-Israel, but in practice they, kind of support Israel.
They're in NATO. They contribute to the security system. They certainly have plenty of beef with the Iranians.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as if the Turks are favorable to Iran. And the Turks will certainly back NATO over anything going on out there. They also have their puppet state in Azerbaijan, their friendly allied state in Azerbaijan, which has been expanding into Armenia. And so the Turks have a stake in contributing to a Western alliance structure that keeps Russia weak, which therefore keeps Armenia weak, which allows Azerbaijan to pick off more Armenian territory.
Mm-hmm. In Syria, right? Wouldn't Iran interfere potentially, like get in the way of Turkey's ambitions with Syria? Because it's an imperialist power of its own. People forget that.
Well, Turkey's main concern is any kind of Kurdish state getting going in Syria or Iraq, because a Kurdish state could then funnel weapons to Kurdish groups in Turkey, which Turkey regards as terrorist groups, or at the very least as potentially terrorist groups with the relevant kind of funding or support. So Turkey's main objective in Syria is to make sure that no Kurdish state is able to get going in northern Syria. And if necessary, Turkey will absorb territory to accomplish that. But of course, the territory that's immediately available in northern Iraq or Syria is not economically very valuable. And it's a security nightmare to try to integrate it because it contains a large population of Kurds who do not like the Turks. So Turkey would prefer for there to be some other kind of order in Syria or Iraq that can discipline and manage the Kurdish population. But if there's nothing else there that can do that, Turkey will look to play that role itself.
Quite some time ago, it feels like it was a long time ago, Israel had retreated from Lebanon after really decimating much of Hezbollah's top command and leadership, leaving them quite a lot weaker. Can't really say the same with the Houthis, though. Americans didn't seem to complete their objectives there. But a lot of the speculation at the time was that what Israel is really doing is it's retreating and preparing for Iran, ultimately. Presumably, Iran would have saw this coming. So with the nuclear capabilities, I mean, it makes a lot of sense why they would probably go ahead to deceive as to where, they're hiding a lot of their materials to create a nuclear bomb, and that they've been prepared for such an attack, unless the Mossad is so heavily capable of knowing everything that they're doing at every moment. I do wonder to what extent, like this, on the behalf of the US and on behalf of the Trump administration, gloating what is happening as a success is largely a PR move to ultimately just kind of end the conflict and prevent it from, not end the conflict, but end, the prospect of like war getting out of control and just leaving on this idea of a victory. Because I even see now a split within Israeli, like pro-Israeli groups, where on the one hand you have Israeli groups who are saying, this is we won. Kind of, and trying to like spin the narrative like, okay, this is done, we won. But a lot of people are angry who think like it's not done and the objective needs to be complete. Iran's regime needs to be fundamentally toppled. So I do wonder, like, because Israel is, what they've been trying to do is they've been deliberately striking members of the Revolutionary Guard, but not the Iranian military, which is separate from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which is tied to the Ayatollah. So it seems like what they kind of want to happen is that the military takes over and kind of topples the Revolutionary Guard, the Ayatollah. On the one hand, like, is this kind of discontinuity that's happening, this attempt to kind of spin what's happening as a victory and get out, America's attempt to prevent this from happening? And how likely is it that this split that the Israeli government was trying to engineer between the military factions in Iran, how likely is that to actually lead to toppling of the Revolutionary Guard, who fundamentally is the executive ruling elite?
So unless Israel has intelligence that suggests that there is a real meaningful split going on between the army and the Revolutionary Guard that could imminently result in regime change. My impulse is to think that that's not very likely. There have been some pretty sizable civil social uprisings and disturbances in Iran in recent years that have not produced that kind of fragmenting in the military. So I'm skeptical that there really is an imminent capacity or willingness on the part of the Iranian regular army to turn on the Revolutionary Guard and to try to overthrow the Ayatollah. Quite skeptical of this. I understand the wishful thinking that the Israelis are engaged in. Their thinking is, as long as Iran is around, isn't there some possibility that Iran could get nuclear weapons? And therefore, isn't there some kind of need? But also, even if you did manage to get a new regime in Iran, it's not a foregone conclusion that that regime would be copacetic with the West and disinclined to get nuclear weapons. There's no guarantee of that kind of regime. And one of the things that really has been frustrating is the degree to which people trying to observe what's going on have taken a lot of the social media posting at face value. Everybody concerned has been fronting heavily on social media, Israel, the United States, and Iran, pretending that they're having levels of success that they're not necessarily having, and trying to use communication on social media to affect the public interpretation of what's going on. A lot of people have abandoned establishment news media reports for understandable reasons. There's distrust of establishment media organizations. But the social media posts on Twitter and TikTok and Instagram are not better sources. They are heavily driven by propagandistic goals rather than attempts to inform at any level. So a lot of the time we have to accept that we don't necessarily know which claims are true. But when there is a case where we see widespread agreement among all of the parties about what has happened, then that's something we really can take on board and work with. And in looking at all of this, the fact that everybody agrees on that really sticks out is that Israel was able to kill those Iranian leaders, those Iranian Revolutionary Guard leaders. It was able to find them, locate them, and kill them. The Iranians agreed that this happened. The Israelis agreed that this happened. The Americans agreed that it happened. That's a very significant fact. And it builds on the things that have been happening recently in the region. So Israel finding, targeting, and killing all of those Hezbollah officials. And then also the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria and the loss of Syria as a friendly state for the Iranians. The rapid collapse of that. These are things that were surprises when they happened. Each of these three things, the liquidation of the Hezbollah leadership, the collapse of Assad, and then the capacity to find, target, and kill these Iranian high command officials. Each of these was a surprise when it occurred, and there was no one who denied that these things occurred. So I think these are the factors that are really shaping what's taking place. There is a concentrated effort here to get Iran to agree to come back into conformity with the IAEA inspection regime. And this is also something I've noticed a lot of ordinary people have missed. The IAEA, back in 2003, was very, very to the point. They said that Iraq had not been restarting its nuclear program, that there was no evidence to suggest that Iraq had restarted the nuclear program.
You mean Iran?
Excuse me, Iraq.
Iraq.
Talking about the IAEA and its role in Iraq. So back in 2003, a lot of people have been making comparisons between this and 2003 and talking about U.S. intelligence and can you trust it?
Mm-hmm.
Back in 2003, the International Atomic Energy Association, IAEA, they said unequivocally that Iraq was not developing weapons of mass destruction, that there was no evidence to suggest that Iraq was developing weapons or that it had restarted the nuclear program, restarted the enrichment program. None. No evidence of this. The IAEA today is saying that Iran is denying it access to certain sites and that Iran has enriched uranium beyond the limits of what would be necessary for a civilian nuclear program. That's not American intelligence. That's the IAEA. So there's a little bit of a different information environment. And this is why it's not just a question of what Israel is thinking about here. Turkey and Egypt and the other Arab states are all concerned about an Iranian nuclear program. And they have said, Egypt and Turkey have said, that if Iran gets nuclear weapons, they will get them. They will stop trusting this alliance system to provide security in the region and get independent nuclear deterrence. So while there is some functionality to having Iran around, there is also a question about what happens if Iran actually does obtain the nuclear weapons. And some real reasons to think that that might be a goal of Iran. In part, just think about it. If you are Iran, it seems very much like many countries are trying to destroy your regime. You have seen that other countries that have had nuclear programs, if they've given those nuclear programs up, those regimes have subsequently been destroyed. And promises made by the West not to destroy those regimes have been broken. The most obvious example being Gaddafi, who gave up a nuclear program, the Libyan dictator, gave up a nuclear program and was then liquidated after promises were made that he wouldn't be touched. So the Iranians have plenty of reason to think that a nuclear program is the thing that can keep them safe, and that promises that they'll be safe if they give up the nuclear program are likely not good faith promises. They have plenty of reason to think that. So they have plenty of reason to want nuclear weapons. It makes sense for them to want nuclear weapons. Or at the very least, it makes sense for them to have a breakout window, to have a period of time that would be necessary to construct a nuclear weapon that's short. And I think that's what they've been aiming for, to have a situation where they've got enough enriched uranium that it's really just a question of assembly. And you have maybe a 3-month assembly window. And you can stay at that point. A lot of countries have a breakout window for nuclear weapons that's less than 6 months. This includes many countries that you wouldn't think of as rogue countries. Germany, for instance, Japan. These are countries that could put together a nuclear weapon in some number of months if they felt it was necessary, but are refraining from doing that. So Iran's argument is, why can't it have a civilian nuclear program like Germany has, or not Germany, like Japan has, right? Why can't it have a program like that and then maintain the kind of breakout window that Japan maintains? Why can't it be 3 or 6 months away from a bomb if it wants to be? Is that incompatible with the Non-Proliferation Treaty? Well, the reason that Iran can't do that is that the other states in its region are uncomfortable with it, and not just Israel and the United States. And there is a possibility of a widespread disruption on the basis of what states like Turkey and Egypt and Saudi Arabia would do. And that's the thing that has completely dropped out of the discussion. There are other Middle Eastern states here that have a stake in what takes place and have established positions that people don't take seriously and don't think of.
Because Saudi Arabia would want a nuclear bomb. Does Turkey have a nuclear bomb?
No, but they could pursue one. And they've said, and of course it could be bluffing. It could be just a way of demonstrating how seriously committed you are on the issue. But they've said that they would get one if Iran gets one.
This might sound like a naive point, but I mean, would it be better if all these countries got a nuclear bomb, in the sense that Pakistan, when Pakistan got a nuclear bomb, it was seen as a bad thing because it was a surprise. They got it with the help of the Chinese. Americans didn't want them to get a nuclear bomb. India certainly didn't. But if you look at the Indo-Pakistani conflict today, the fact that they both have nuclear bombs is, reason for greater caution, if anything, and arguably has, prompted de-escalation more than it would otherwise, because it just gives a reason to not escalate beyond, some skirmishes.
This is a grand old debate in IR theory, the nuclear peace theory, the theory that the way to make peace in the world is to have everybody have nuclear weapons, versus the non-proliferation paradigm, which operates on the premise that you want to reduce the number of trigger fingers. of hands on the trigger. The NPT is, of course, based on the latter theory. And so the world we're living in is grounded on the latter theory. But the nuclear peace theory has always been a player in international politics, and it is something that you can raise. And there might be some truth to that. Perhaps the region would be more peaceful if the major players in the region had nuclear weapons. There's an argument for that. And that's in part why the United States doesn't have to be so overwhelmingly committed to preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons as to do regime change there. The United States can prefer that Iran not get nuclear weapons and do things to demonstrate to Iran that it would be not good for them to go all the way and make a bomb. They should stay 3 months or so away from a bomb or 6 months or so away from a bomb indefinitely. That's what's safe for them to do, with inspectors to make sure that they don't advance toward making a bomb, and that they should comply with the inspection routine so as to calm down the other states in the region. That's the best way for the Iranian regime to survive. If the Ayatollah wants to survive, his best way to survive is to stay 3 or 6 months away from a bomb with regular inspections, where he complies with the IAEA inspections, and those inspections say, don't worry, it's okay, they have not progressed toward a bomb. That's the way for war to be prevented and for the Iranian regime to remain in place. And then while the Iranian regime remains in place 3 or 6 months away from a bomb, the other states in the region will remain concerned enough about Iran that they'll be pliable and cooperative with Israel and the United States. That's the win-win for both Iran and Israel and the United States.
At the beginning, you mentioned this question of data that Israel might have due to its intelligence. I mean, Israel has claimed that as Mossad bases in Iran itself, which is a pretty big claim. Not totally unbelievable, given the sheer amount of dissent that seems to exist in Iran. And the reason why I do think it's not impossible that Iran does have a regime change is just because of the lack of legitimacy the government has. I mean, Iran is one of those regimes that, while a lot of people who are pro-Palestine want to kind of treat it as the enemy of the enemy is my friend, which is totally understandable. They're one of the only people who kind of helps any sort of resistance against Israel. I totally understand that. And relative to the aggression of Israel, Iran is in many ways bullied by the Western powers, if you view it that way. However, overwhelmingly from just about like every Iranian person I've ever met, actually from all of, no matter what year they migrated, they tend to oppose the regime. It's a question of whether they support U.S. and Israeli intervention in it. And the ones who are immigrated from Iran during the, after the Shah was overthrown, those kind of people usually supported. The people in the Iran-Iraq war tend to not be more skeptical of America. But across the board, it's kind of like what I heard always from Syrians about the Assad dictatorship. It was always like, at best, you would get hard cynicism and like, oh, there's nothing that can be changed. Nothing will be better. But nobody who really defends it. The only people I've seen hard defend, who've left those countries are like people on the internet who are, consider themselves to be like anti-Western, living in the West. I guess you would call them the tankies or whatever. But within that group, because of that, like, it's not the only thing holding Iran together, it seems like the thing that's holding the regime together, in power, is the sheer force of the military, which is a very weak basis, especially if the military itself is not united. We know with the National Guard and the military that's separate from that. That's pretty weak. Like, it does seem to me like it's a very weak regime. Probably even weaker than like the likes of North Korea, which North Korea is weak in the fact that they have to prevent people from leaving the country in order to hold on to power. But like, as far as I'm aware, North Korea doesn't have like as much of a divided military. Like, it doesn't have like these different factions that could be pit against each other, whereas Iran does. So it doesn't seem like impossible in many ways. It could like happen without America, pressing a finger.
So 2 things I would raise. First, expat syndrome is a real thing. that I've observed over the course of my life. People who leave countries tend to be very different from the people who still live in them. For one, anyone that we can talk to who's from a country can speak a language that we can speak. So this means that there tends to be a certain social or class bias in any kind of expat perspective. Secondly, once you're an expat, you are not in the country. So disorder in the country or violence in the country doesn't affect you in precisely the same way that it does if you're there. It becomes a bit more abstract. And this is even the case if you have relatives who still live in the country. So expats, in my experience, don't tend to think about the countries that they're from in the same way as people living in those countries. And I'll even say that, when I was in the UK as an international student, the way that I would think about what was going on in the United States as someone living in the UK was, of course, different from the way that people were thinking about events when they were living in the country. When I would come back to Indiana, there would be a little bit of an adjustment for me as I would talk to people who had been living in the country while I had been following the news from outside of it. And it was something that I came to have to try to adjust for and to remember, I'm not there right now. So it hits differently when people are there. The second thing I would raise here is, my argument about embedded democracies. I have this argument that in the United States, part of the reason why our democracy sticks around is that people can't imagine an alternative regime that they could get to. In the case of Iran, I think people can imagine an alternative regime that would be better, but they have a hard time imagining how to get there from here. And they see a lot of different ways that in trying to get there from here, things could go badly wrong. And so this, I think, has been the main strength of the Iranian regime. There's a question about, can you in an orderly way get from this regime to the regime that you want? And the widespread belief that that is unlikely to happen has allowed this regime to persist, even though there isn't necessarily a lot of positive attachment to it. So that would be the thing that I think, really, if this regime goes another 20 years, will be the reason why. There does seem to be, and I think the U.S. interventions in the region have contributed to this, widespread belief that an attempt to change the regime will produce disorder that will be destructive.
Yeah, that's why I wonder, could this happen without American intervention?
The Arab Spring also is an instructive kind of case here. What happened in Syria, in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia, in these countries that attempted to change the regime? A lot of the time what happened is that foreign states saw the disorder as an opportunity to weaken a rival and purposefully set about strengthening forces that would not have been able to prevail on their own, so as to produce a stalemate and a protracted long conflict that would devastate the country. Whether Israel or the United States would do that, you can bet your bottom dollar that the Gulf states would see any kind of civil conflict in Iran as a major opportunity to produce a forever war. And those states have the money and the weapons purchasing capacity to do that. And that, I think, has to be the big concern for Iran and for Iranians living in Iran. Not just a U.S. or Israeli intervention, but what those Gulf states would do to try to muck things up.
Of course they would have an interest in that.
And they can do it easily because they don't need ground troops. They just have to find groups in Iran to arm. And Iran is a multi-ethnic, very diverse country with a lot of different population groups.
Well, that's what I wanted to point out, I wanted to add is, while Iran is diverse, one big difference between Iran and Syria and Iraq or even Lebanon, it doesn't have the same degree of local tribalism that it does. It is there is a broader Persian culture that makes up a majority in Iran, that they have all kind of great myths that they unite their people around. Like they have Zoroastrianism, they have one of the oldest civilizations. There's a kind of social glue an identity to being Iranian that isn't inherently tied to like even Shia Islam, right? Like there's an Iranian identity there. So there's a lot of ways in which I could see, a sort of movement that is oppositional being shaped. It's just a question of like where that will go. Because of course, I think the most obvious, least imaginative alternative people tend to think of is like, just having the Shah's son or something, or grandson take power, because like for a lot of the Iranians, they think like a secular dictatorship will be better than whatever exists now. But even like the fact that they have this sort of like grand narrative and cultural fabric that I don't like. Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon are carved up by the British Empire, right? Iraq and Syria can claim, history more than Lebanon can, but still, like the borders between these countries, the tribal ethnicities are far more diverse, and like there's just not a sense of like nationhood in the way that there is in the likes of Iran, like a kind of like cult. No, I wouldn't even say nationhood. It's not even accurate. I would just say culture, which is why I
that
think
there's more internal unity than in Iraq, but it's a big bet, and it's a harder bet to make if you're there, and you have to potentially pay the cost of it going wrong. And there have been, just in the last 10, 15 years, so many examples of someone trying to do regime change in a Middle Eastern country. And how many of these are attractive cases? The reason that the Arab Spring became the Arab Winter, there isn't an obvious country you can point to and say, oh yeah, this is how ideally it would go for them.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you that Iran is not like Iraq, and it's a bigger country with more basis for thinking that it could end up like Turkey, but even Egypt, which has a lot of internal unity, became badly divided after the Mubarak regime was overthrown. And what did they end up with? They ended up with a military dictatorship that looks a lot like the Mubarak regime, and is less experienced, and therefore tends to be more heavy-handed and to make more mistakes, like when the Egyptians killed that Cambridge PhD student who was just there to study, the history of the labor movement. And they whacked him and then tried to cover it up very badly. This is something that happened while I was out at Cambridge. And it was a huge story, because he was Italian. The Italian government and the British government were both enraged about it. But it was because it was a new dictatorship and was inexperienced, didn't know what to do, was seeing problems and threats where none existed because it had emerged in a very unstable and dangerous period. And it's this same regime that's now asked to take on the risk of sorting out the situation in Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
These are guys who came to power scared.
I've heard another hypothesis as to why Iran hasn't had, like, it's had tons of revolt, but why it hasn't had like the extent of revolts that it had even with the Iranian Revolution that led to the current regime, right? Is demographics, because it has one of the worst birth rates in the Middle East, actually. And as aging population, when you have an aging population, just less young people on average, young people more likely to, pick up arms and rebel. So you have that kind of like there that puts it at a disadvantage or puts any like opposition at a disadvantage, because older people are going to, generally gravitate to safety. Egypt and India, for example, are like kind of like cases of the high birth rate countries that have very high birth rates.
That's an
India.
excellent
Let's not talk about India, but like because it's different. That's a whole other case in itself. But Egypt, many have speculated too, like to the extent of is there an opening for kind of opposition there? And given that, I mean, like the population does not support Israel, yet the government does, right? And you have that problem in Jordan too. It's also kind of like a weak legitimacy state, and it's led to like a lot of Arabs have this like stereotype about Egyptians, is like the people who are too like lazy and always sleeping. it's a kind of weird like Levantine remark Levantine Arabs make about Egyptians, I've noticed, because it's like, why don't you guys do anything? You clearly can.
Well,
But
they've
yes,
tried it a lot of times over
They
the
try.
years to do things. And every time they try, somebody shuts them down. You know, they try the Arab Spring. Egypt was the signature case of a major state attempting regime change during that period. You know, and Egypt tried it when Saudi Arabia did not, Jordan did not, Iran did not. It did not go well. The Egyptians tried over and over and over again to invade Israel and get rid of it and create a large Arab state. They tried many times. It did not go well for them over and over. So there are these historical lessons that Egypt has been taught by repeated failure and great suffering. And some of these other countries are learning or have learned similar kinds of lessons just by watching what's happened to Egypt. So the question is, can you imagine, if you're living in Iran, can you imagine taking action that isn't going to land you in the same kind of spot as those countries that went through the Arab Spring? If you're living in Egypt today, can you imagine it? A younger population makes it easier to imagine because a younger population has a shorter historical memory.
Yeah.
And that's a major difference. But even with that, this Sisi regime, despite being very incompetent in running the economy, not altogether very well, has not managed to fall yet, in part because that Arab winter lesson is still very much sitting in the back of everybody's mind. Why would you think it would go better this time? That's the question. And nobody's been able to give a good answer.
Well, it was the UAE who helped facilitate the coup against the Muslim Brotherhood and put Sisi in because they see the Muslim Brotherhood as their one of their rival factions to their own power, especially the UAE and Saudi Arabia, because the part of why they had the beef with that journalist, right, back in the day.
Right. If your revolution is just an opportunity for some foreign state to put in a government that they like, geez, why bother? You're talking about a revolution in an authoritarian state where you can get beat up or killed. Why should you do that if it's going to end in some foreign state co-opting it? Yikes.
You're tempting me to go to a separate topic, but I don't want to. But maybe I'll just introduce the idea to open up the window for a future conversation. But one big issue I've seen with communist internationalism, or you could say even more broadly, leftist internationalism, is that historically a big issue that became with a weakness with communist parties is that the internationalism was seen as a veil for Soviet influence. And to some extent, that kind of was true. And the more I looked at the failure of the socialists in Italy and why the fascists took power, a big theme, it seemed, is that a lot of Italians saw the communist internationalism as just a kind of way to let the Soviet Union expand influence and therefore Russian influence into Italy. And if we're to be honest as to the function the Comintern ended up playing and that communist parties ended up playing as mouthpieces for Soviet policy, I mean, this is a whole separate thing, but it's like a critique of the problem is I support internationalism in the sense that we need global problems can't be solved domestically, right? You need cooperation between nations. But the issue with internationalist politics in a domestic context is that, there's a huge suspicion of that because it can be used for just the absence of a nationalist politics can lead to some other influence,
Yeah, there has to be a genuine supranationalism. There has to be an attempt to have some sort of political framework that really does go beyond the nation state. Otherwise, it's a block of states being led by an anchor state that's going to dominate that block. It's not going to be, robustly internationalist in the kind of way that it would need to be to secure the cooperation of a large plurality of different states or populations over an extended period of time. It's a great point.
Yeah, I mean, it's why people gravitate away from the liberal, even internationalism, because it's seen as a veil for American hegemony. And I mean, are they wrong to some extent, and how that's been used?
You got to make these blocks things that people actually want to be part of. They have to see a real possibility of stuff getting better for them. And if you don't admit them on equal terms, if you give them bad deals, bad arrangements, and you mistreat them, then there's going to be a reluctance to join. Unfortunately, in recent decades, the American strategy has been to try to show that if you don't join, then you have no future. And therefore, you have to join on whatever terms are offered to you. And so you end up with these soft allied states like Egypt or Turkey that are never treated appropriately. But it's even true of the Western states. The Western states, the Western European states are not treated as well by this system as they ought to be. The use of Russia to discipline them is not altogether different from the use of Iran to discipline the Arab states.
It's a very good point. There's a very good point. Speaking of globalists, I've noticed, the people who are big believers in BRICS and the sort of anti-West alliance aren't really having a good day, aren't having a good time just in general. And because I've seen genuine confusion as to why Russia or China aren't, swooping in to go protect Iran or to protect Palestine. And, can you explain
what would
to
be
them,
more
why?
effective? Imagine what would be, the dream of the United States is that China would choose to help the Iranians. Because if China would help the Iranians, then it would become incredibly easy for the United States to make the argument that Iran and Russia are front countries for China. And if Iran and Russia seem to be front countries for China, then all of the small European and Middle Eastern states become bound to containing China. Right now, and for a long time, those countries have thought, why can't we trade with China and have a security arrangement with the United States? Why can't we have it both ways? What's the big deal? China's on the other side of the world. What do we care? If China becomes involved in helping Iran or in helping Russia, China will create a large number of enemies in the Middle East and in Europe. The BRICS thing, the narrative of BRICS, is incredibly useful because it suggests that if you have a problem with any of the other states in BRICS, then therefore you should have a problem with China. Because each of those states that is in BRICS or considers being part of BRICS has a lot of enemies.
None of these countries seem to really be united. I mean, the India case is the more obvious one, but
they don't even get the benefits of the unity that is ascribed to them. And then also they are attracting negative attention from these other states and facilitating the consolidation of the alliance system of the United States by doing that. It's very foolish.
The big thing too is the confusion as to why Russia is not supporting, because there's a lot of the people who are, Duginist types who want to really think that Russia is going to come in and help. And
Russia couldn't even help Assad. Russia can't even help Armenia. Russia is not going to come and save the day for the Iranians. Russia can't even defend the states that have been essential to its security system for the whole time the Russian Federation has been around. Armenia is losing territory to a state that's backed principally by Turkey, because the Russians have no capacity at this stage to defend Armenia while continuing to prosecute the Ukraine war. The Russians allowed the Assad regime to collapse because they decided it was not a high enough priority relative to the other stuff they had to deal with. A lot of what's been going on over the last 5 years is that the American alliance system was shocked that Ukraine was able to defend against Russia and hold off the Russian invasion with the amount of military aid that Ukraine had been given, which was considered to be not altogether very much. This caused the Western system to go, whoa, if this is possible, what else is possible? And to start pushing the limits in other parts of the world on the assumption that Iran and Russia are substantially weaker than they appear and are not going to be able ultimately to stop this activity. And what have we seen since then? Not only has Ukraine been able to hold off the Russians, but Syria has collapsed. Hezbollah has been liquidated. there's been an enormous amount of, from the point of view of the Western system, military success, which has invited further military use and a more aggressive militaristic posture. They're not doing it because they're crazy. They're doing it because they think they've discovered that they're much stronger than they thought that they were. And it's having the opposite effect from Iraq. So Iraq made the Western system go, oh, there's a lot of things the military just can't do. There's a lot of problems it just can't solve. Therefore, there's got to be negotiation. The situation in Ukraine
In Afghanistan.
reveals a different possibility. Yeah, Afghanistan as well. The situation in Ukraine reveals a different possibility, which is if you can find a country that actually is willing to fight and you arm that country, it doesn't take that much in the way of weapons to produce a country that can defend itself for many years at a time against what would have been thought to be a much stronger country not so very long ago. That has completely altered the way that the United States thinks about how to deal with its problems. And this is something that whether you like it, don't like it, normatively, you can have all kinds of attitudes to it. This is a fact about how things are going now since the Russian invasion of Ukraine that really matters for understanding how this system works.
It kind of seems like almost we're living a new period of, you could call the neocon turn in the 80s, when before that time, there was like the realist geopolitical consensus, marked by like the likes of Kissinger and Nixon, who accepted the Soviet Union as a fact. Whereas the neocons believed, and kind of in many ways, the neocons are more like ultra liberals, in that they really believe in the universality of like liberal ideas and believe that the system is inherently, their systems are superior, and that the inferiority of the ideas of like the Soviet Union were going to lead to collapse there. And that if they were to push the limits, they could actually bring down the Soviet Union. And they saw like little like cracks. I think Afghanistan, in many ways, Afghanistan for the Soviets was kind of the Ukraine for Russia in that case. Like that's why like Carter, kind of in many ways is seen to have like restarted the Cold War, because he backed, defended he backed Afghani rebels against the Soviets, right? And then later be like basically jihadis, the mujahideen. With like the neocon turn, it was kind of like, no, actually, let's not try to only resolve this through diplomacy. Let's actually, push the Soviet Union to the breaking point by restarting the arms race and all that. And it's kind of almost as if Russia, rather than challenging the West, I don't like this term, the West, but like I would say just American hegemony, it's kind of actually like strengthened it rather than really challenge it, because it's sort of given it way more confidence in uniting Europe with it, getting Europe back on its side. Not only has Russia struggled with Ukraine, it's like even still, despite the Trump election and Trump saying he's going to get out of that conflict, unlike what the liberals wanted, who are more, in many ways, Democrats are like more neocon on that issue. Still, like Ukraine seems to be like just like full on just doing attacks on Russian territory, not just defending itself, full on like totally like humiliating Russia, frankly. And it's
these drone strikes on the Russian long-range bombers. People really should think about what kind of world does the United States think it lives in, that it believes can use drones in Russian territory to destroy the strategic long-range bombers that are part of the nuclear trident. They're certainly not all of the nuclear trident. Russia has a robust nuclear deterrent that involves other parts of its military apparatus. Long-range bombers are really the least important part of the trident. The intercontinental ballistic missiles and the submarines especially are more central. But the fact that the United States could do that, and could do that expecting that Russia would not retaliate in a way that would really seriously adversely affect the United States or cause political problems for the United States at home, that Russia would not even disrupt the global economy to the point at which it produces economic problems in the United States that would result in potentially electoral defeat for the government. The United States isn't worried about that at all. And this isn't, just Trump, because Biden was doing the same kind of stuff over there. And Trump was saying when he was out of office, what, is Biden crazy? He gets into office, looks at whatever intelligence Biden was looking at and says, let's keep going and doing the same stuff ultimately.
That very
Because
much
what did he
validates
find? The
your point.
Russians were not willing to agree to the kind of deal that the United States was looking for in the region, which is the same problem that Biden found.
That validates your point on one of our previous episodes, where you mentioned that like part of why you think the United States and Ukraine have such confidence in doing these audacious attacks on Russian soil and to keep pushing Russia without fear of, serious retaliation, at least on the American behalf, is because they know something we fundamentally don't. At the level of like, they just have probably, Moscow, just totally infiltrated with spies. They know things we don't. And the fact that Trump and Vance were so anti-war, so anti, backing Ukraine, yet like now they're in power, it doesn't really seem like the proxy war that America's been backing in Ukraine against Russia has stopped at all.
No. And how did the Israelis find all of these senior figures in the Iranian military and get them? There has got to be a major development of the intelligence gathering apparatus versus 20 years ago. Because in the height of the Cold War, you would never find a president willing to do this kind of stuff. It would have been assumed that you could not be sure what would happen if you did it and that there would be massive retaliation. And Joe Biden and Donald Trump are old men who come from the Cold War era, who as adults were habituated to thinking in terms of the deterrence theory that operated in that period. These are not young people who don't remember how to think about deterrence. There has got to be something going on out there. And each time one of these crazy, wild, amazing operations is carried out, where stuff gets found and destroyed in places where you never thought it could be touched, what happens? A lot of people ignore this, minimize it, and yet these are things that even the Russians and even the Iranians agree occurred. These are things nobody denies.
And I mean, who ultimately created the internet as we know it?
And it's really
Pentagon.
inconvenient to communicate without the internet, isn't it? It's just really a pain. And it seems like again and again, leaders in other countries have decided it's too hard to not communicate in a way that can be ultimately tracked by the United States. We saw this even with the Pete Hegseth phone scandal. Even the Americans find it inconvenient to try to communicate in a way that is actually secure. What did you used to have to do? You used to have to actually send people to speak things. You used to have to transport handwritten notes with ciphers and codes and things like that. It was a pain. So the best way to do it was to actually send people and talk in person in rooms. Nobody wants to do that. It takes too long. You lose too much in the amount of time that it takes to move information in those ways. And that didn't used to be the case. In the 80s, in the 70s, when information transfer was harder to do anyway, you didn't lose as much by taking the slow, safe, careful, communicative route. Now there's such a cost in terms of time and speed to do it the safe way that increasingly governments are communicating in an unsafe way where a lot of what they are putting out can be intercepted. That seems to me to be the only way to explain how these attacks can happen. Why would Hezbollah lieutenants agree to carry around phones for long enough, the same phone for long enough, that that phone could be used to track their movements, establish their routine, create a network of who they know? These organizations used to be much more careful about this stuff, but it seems that at this point, they're no longer able or willing to do that.
It does run very deep because there's also people have written like Peter Dale Scott, and there's this other author who I'm trying to remember his name, but he also like worked in the intelligence community about, the deep state, right? And the deep connection between Silicon Valley and the deep state. In fact, like a large part of there's a huge connection between arms operations and, the Pentagon, but also like information transfer with the NSA and big tech. But I mean, we're seeing it in broad daylight with the likes of ChatGPT now basically doing like a kind of military contract with the Pentagon. It's at this point, like, whether we think this is bad, which I mean, I would say clearly is, it's pretty scary. One can't deny that this spells a different story than a lot of leftists or a lot of just anti-imperialists would want to believe, which is that the American empire is declining. I mean, I've been hearing that my whole life. People who are far older than me say that they've been hearing it their whole life, but it doesn't seem to be happening. In fact, if anything seems to be happening, it's kind of the opposite. America's entering like a new age of hegemony, which is
And that doesn't mean
really scary to process, right? Like
that doesn't mean that living under it is good or that it works in a good way or that you ought to feel any kind of warm, fuzzy feelings about it. Life can get worse in a state in various ways while that state becomes more powerful or remains powerful relative to other states. Part of what's going on is we got this global system, which makes it harder and harder for any state to protect its population from the commodification of every area of human life. And so every state, because every state is territorial and bound and limited, is finding it increasingly difficult to manage transnational flows of people, of money, of tax revenue. It's getting harder and harder to create any kind of order that sticks for any length of time, that can be felt psychologically by your citizens as stability in their lives. So, yes, of course, it seems like life is getting worse. And in many different respects, it is getting worse. But that doesn't mean that your state has become militarily impotent or is no longer able to compete in international politics. Part of what's so frustrating about the world that we're living in is that even as it gets worse, it seems to become harder to change.
Well, you've brought us a perfect segue, which is change. Speaking of change, something that I think is, I would say, undeniably a sliver of good news is the election in the primary for the New York mayoral race of Zohran Mamdani. A socialist Muslim who's pro-Palestine just won in the most Jewish city in the world outside of Israel. To me, the big deal in that is not just that he describes himself as a democratic socialist, because that's still a big deal, but it's that he's like pro-Palestine and Muslim. I mean, he's a secular guy. He's a New Yorker. He's an American, right? Despite what all the racists who are reacting to him have to say about that. But still, like, electorally, you wouldn't think this guy had a chance. I was very cynical about him winning. I didn't think like he was going to win. I was very surprised. I was very happy about it. I don't know. What is the Studebaker take on it? I saw your tweets. I have a feeling you're gonna tell us something that's not gonna be, there might be a little black pilling or of sorts. But what do you have, just in general? What do you have to say about like the election of Mamdani?
So, after the Bernie thing happened, there was this kind of regression in the horizon of what democratic socialism was going to mean, which you saw in that human infrastructure bill that Bernie was championing early in the Biden years. So what was the kind of big thing that was supposed to sell that? It was subsidized childcare. And I went to a rally that Bernie, did for the human infrastructure bill in Indiana. And Bernie said, in this competitive global economy, it's no longer realistic for a parent to stay home with the kids. And therefore, there's got to be childcare subsidy. And to me, the structure of that argument was incredibly accommodationist. In this competitive global economy, nobody gets to be a stay-at-home parent. Forget the whole should it be the man, should it be the woman gender thing. Irrelevant. Nobody gets the choice to do that anymore if they're working class. Nobody's going to be free to do that. And it's not going to be an aspiration anymore to make people free to do that if they want. And a lot of people respond with, oh, I don't want to have kids, or, oh, I don't care if I'm at home with my kids. I want my kid in daycare or whatever. What about the choice, though? What about the option? The fact that it has become, that's become the signature thing for the left is a dramatic reduction of horizon relative to 5 years ago. Dramatic reduction of horizon. Now, I, of course, think it would be lovely if the buses in New York were free. And I think that's something that the mayor of New York can probably do. He can probably make the buses free. But the mayor of New York does not have the physical capacity to solve the housing crisis there. You know, when you're Bernie Sanders and you're mayor of Burlington, you want to set up a housing collective. You could purchase land, you can build houses on it. A city like New York has had a bunch of infrastructure that it's been committed to for 100 years. Expensive, difficult to rearrange infrastructure, physical infrastructure that limits what you can do. If you go and you just build taller towers everywhere, which is what the abundance people want to do in San Francisco and New York, just build really tall, low-income housing towers. What does that do to your public transit? What does that do to your roads? What does that do to traffic on the streets? How do you handle the consequences of that? Well, even if you permit people to build these big towers, you have to build infrastructure. So what are you going to do? Eminent domain it and reconstruct a bunch of stuff? Where are you getting the money for that? And this is where you start to run into the limits of you want to cram more and more people into these mega cities on the coasts. You do not have the physical capacity to build the actual transportation infrastructure that you need to have that be anything other than deeply unpleasant for everybody who lives in the city. So what does it do? It sets people up to complain about overcrowding, which often leads to complaints about immigration and then also crime and violence. I am not confident that local government, mayoral government, can meaningfully improve people's lives in a major city like New York to the point at which it would become some kind of wider model that other people could follow. There are some localities where you have land that you could more easily control, undeveloped land, and you could put it to some kind of positive purpose in places where you're less committed to a set of existing infrastructure. There's some stuff that can be tried in those places where there's land available. Big megacities like New York, where there's a lot of concentrated money, there's also a whole system of wards, an assembly system that's very deeply rooted, that goes back a long way, that's in bed with the party system. It's a very difficult kind of place to try to deliver the sort of change that would be inspiring to people or might compel people to think that more is possible. And what really makes me sad about it, like fundamentally sad about it, is that I see a load of people who are selling this like it's Bernie Sanders. We've been reduced to treating the mayor of a city like he's running to be president of the United States. And when Bernie Sanders was running for president, we were talking about reconstructing the healthcare sector of the United States. 17% of the GDP of the United States is its healthcare sector, compared to 3% for the military-industrial complex. 17 versus 3, huge part of the economy. And we were trying very seriously can we get control over this chunk of the United States and reconfigure it to save people money, to give people access to healthcare who don't have it, to enable employers to pay people more because they wouldn't have to waste a bunch of their compensatory capacity purchasing private insurance. This is the kind of stuff that I thought might generate a higher horizon. And if you could free people from having to worry about healthcare, they'd be freer to change jobs because they wouldn't have to worry about losing their insurance. They'd be freer to take action their employer might not like because they would be less worried about losing their healthcare. It could have opened up real possibility. Now what's the horizon? Childcare. Because what? Nobody's going to have any time to be at home with their kid. This is not what I got involved with the left for. And people are going to waste 20 years of their life on this because they're going to think that this is going to help them. And they're going to make the same mistakes that the millennials made in the early 10s and waste huge amounts of time on this. And you're not going to get socialists elected in the kinds of states Bernie won in the primaries, in the red states, with this kind of campaign. And did you see the demographics of who he actually won? He didn't win people who don't have college degrees.
Yeah, that's why I predicted he wouldn't win, actually. That's why I was surprised he won.
Yeah.
Because if you saw a thread of tweets, I deleted the main first one, but I kept the rest just because I didn't want to spoil people's good news. And also because I was wrong in my prediction. But basically, I said he's making the same mistake that the left's been making since the 60s at least, which is McGovern syndrome, which is relying so heavily on educated young people, college-educated young people, and at the expense of, reaching out to older people. And what you get is this kind of classic trope of, leftism is when you're young, and then when you're old, you become conservative. That's what you do. And it's a sort of cycle. And it's this, but the problem is because the problem with like young people, they have energy and they also have a lot of platforms, a lot of time. And so when they, spread a campaign, it can really make it seem like that campaign, that candidate, that cause is a lot more popular than it actually is. And it creates this
and they have a short historical memory. They forget.
Right.
They forget stuff within 10 or 15 years. They forget because they're young. They weren't there. So we were talking about this in relation to the Arab Spring. They don't remember. And just what makes me really sad is the huge waste of human potential that this potentially represents. If this is taken up and people think that they can make this a model, because he could win. You could elect somebody like this mayor of New York or San Francisco. You could. Just like when AOC won, there were a bunch of people who thought that was a model. And they tried to run those kinds of candidates all over the country. But what happens? Those kinds of candidates, they can win in some places where there's heavily gerrymandered Democratic safe seats, where you're talking about a city that's 60% or more Democrat voting in a presidential election. Sure. Those kinds of candidates can win in places where Democrats and Hillary Clinton are already well-liked. But they don't give you any kind of new possibility for reaching out to people in the parts of the country I'm from and familiar with.
Indiana.
Yeah.
I want
to. It seems to be a even ever greater retreat of these people into the very weird parts of the country where there's still enough of them that they can talk to each other and talk each other into stuff. You're talking about the New York DSA. There's a concentration of people where you can run a DSA. By definition, you're talking about a part of the country that does not look like most of it.
So I want to return to the childcare point because that's actually very interesting, and I want to return to that because that's a separate thing, but I think it's very important. With regard to his victory, I do want to say in defense of the people who are very excited, it's, what he actually does, the amount of change. I mean, I think a lot of people are aware that there's only so much you can do as a mayor, right? The fact is that like having him win does give an indication of what's possible to some extent. I don't think it really gives an indication of what's possible across the board, which is what you're saying about like, can they win in all these other areas? I will say this though, is that like for me, it's actually the kind of pro-Palestine in me that's more excited about this victory than the leftists in me. Because, the fact that it's like a left progressive can win in New York is not like that's happened in Chicago in the 80s. The height of anti-communism. It's happened, I mean, like the Canada has had, socialist premiers, right? I know that Canada is actually bad at comparison. We're much more socialistic than Americans are. But the big thing is that, I mean, this is like the most Jewish city in the world. AIPAC was super against him. And, AIPAC was an excuse for left candidates losing various other elections like Jamal Bowman. One, it shows that despite the existence of AIPAC, the Jewish lobby, you can run and not be like a pro-Israeli sycophant and win. For me, that's the big victory. It's the victory over like AIPAC. It's also like a demolishment of this kind of anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And now I don't want to say like, because technically, I guess his official position is Zionist in the sense that he does acknowledge Israel's right to exist, right? He didn't go full on like, but he was like, in terms of people can kind of see what he believes. If you look at his history, it's not hard to tell, he's pretty firmly anti-Israel, and the people who are pro-Israel know that. And that's why they're kind of freaking out. And, like the thing is like the feebled politics on Israel that I've seen from the left in America and in so many other countries is kind of what's always, it's really pissed me off. Whereas, they can't think of anything beyond just like let's not kill as many civilians, or Netanyahu is bad, but not like a deeper criticism of Israel, not even an acknowledgement that what is happening is, in part of real resistance, not just like blatant terrorism. Like that's the thing about a lot of the left treats what has happened in Israel and Palestine is like just terrorism, and that's it. And that Israel is like killing, and the problem with Israel is it kills too many people, but it wasn't unjustified in the broader conflict. They don't look back prior to October 7th. This has been a problem with left parties like the NDP. It refuses to even, call what's happening a genocide. I mean, to see what is happening, I think it's more of a victory of the pro-Palestine movement ideologically than it is an indication that socialism is going to happen. Because, New York, sure, New York is woke. This is an urban city, whatever. But, I don't think he ran on a woke campaign. The issue still persists of a, college-educated sort of camp, like people who are fundamentally running the campaign. New York DSA are like college-educated young people, which is still the issue, and that's why I tweeted about it. But at the level of messaging, he didn't do a lot of the issues that, like a lot of left candidates have been doing. He just stuck to I want to make New York more affordable. He didn't talk about like culture war stuff. He didn't do those mistakes. He didn't, have these silly positions on we need to defund the police, which I know there's a nuanced position on. I think the police is overfunded. But, rhetorically speaking, the way in which the left articulated those positions before was disastrous and unpopular. The way in which he framed issues, I thought was just at the level of just pure campaigning, was much better than a lot of the left candidates have been.
He still didn't win the voters who didn't go to college, and he didn't win low-income voters as a group, even doing all of that. Yeah,
Is that confirmed that he didn't win low income?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe both low income and non-college, he did not win those demographics.
Low income in general, really?
Yeah, at least in terms of they're still counting.
Students classify as low income, but they're just sociologically different. Like a lot of students do classify as low income.
I believe he didn't even win low income voters. They're still counting, especially if you're talking about in terms of after they do the transfers of the ranked ballot. It might look a little different. I'm talking.
Because if you lost low income, that would totally. I mean, that would.
Yeah, I don't believe he won even the low income group. So that messaging. Yeah, sure. I would rather somebody message on economic issues than focus on really divisive stuff. But it doesn't seem to be that effective in terms of changing what the voter profile looks like for a left-wing candidate, a socialist candidate, a sensibly socialist candidate. The Palestine stuff, the major value of an organization like AIPAC has always been money rather than votes. If you look at American, voter issues, what do they prioritize? What are the important issues facing the country? Israel and Palestine and the Middle East have not scored very high since there were troops deployed to Iraq. The thing that ultimately makes Americans care about foreign policy is the possibility of troops being deployed, because that means you could be deployed, your friends could be deployed, your family could be deployed. Ordinary people in the country become worried about foreign policy if it means their friends, their family members might die in a war. And when people try to get them to care on the basis of abstract moral concerns, and they're not able to tie it into something which affects the day-to-day life, it just doesn't tend to be that important an issue. And I think in some ways, by focusing on the Palestine issue, they helped him, because this meant that they were not talking about his proposal to have social workers come to emergencies. This idea that you complement the police with some organization of social workers that try to provide a more positive intervention, I think it strikes a lot of people as naive. Whether it is or isn't, I think it strikes a lot of voters that way. And I think that the law and order question is going to be, in the general election, the more effective tactic, rather than talking about Israel or Palestine, for somebody trying to beat him. But the other thing I would raise also is that not only did he win in New York, he won against Cuomo, who is alleged to be an abuser of women, who is alleged to have contributed with his policy to the deaths of large numbers of people in nursing homes. This is a very muddied candidate who has been through a lot and who is not somebody who commands a large amount of positive support. They talk about how much money he had, and certainly people donated a lot of money to him, but many of the people who donated money to him are the same people who told him he shouldn't run because given his reputation and the things that he had been involved with, there were major liabilities, major weaknesses. And then in the general election, you're talking about Eric Adams, a guy who's been accused of being paid by Turkey, being a paid agent of the Turkish government, and all sorts of other ticky-tack, corruption kinds of things. Somebody made a joke on the internet that it's like Mamdani's fighting a series of the, Democratic Party bosses, like the most corrupt, horrible mayors that anybody's ever seen in the United States. And I don't think that's necessarily true. That might be overstating it. But nonetheless, the perception that Cuomo and Adams are exceptionally corrupt means that it shouldn't be that difficult for somebody to beat them in a race, especially given the campaign finance laws in the city of New York, which are weird. You get money, you get funding from the city to match your funding, not just matching, but I think it's like 8-to-1, the ratio of how much you get from the city versus how much you get from residents. So somebody like Mamdani, if he raises, I think $1 million, he gets 8 million. So it's a weird funding environment relative to the rest of the country. You have exceptionally unpopular mayors and politicians running. But people are going to think that this gives them a model, and then they're going to waste a lot of time and energy. And they're going to tell everybody, if you're not positive about it, if you don't act like it's the most wonderful thing that ever happened, that you're being a killjoy. And then what that means is that all of the work that people like I did since 2020 to try to get us to think through this stuff a little bit more, they're going to aggressively try to sweep all this stuff under the rug and try to get a new group of young people who have not lived through this stuff to make the same mistakes. Except now they'll be making it on behalf of subsidized childcare in New York, as opposed to Medicare for all in the United States. So it's regressed, it's tragedy.
So to respond to some of what you're saying there, to play on behalf of those who are, excited, I'm sure this is going to lead to some level of delusion, but also I think, at least as far as what I've seen, a lot of people are trying to remind, people to not think that this is only the beginning. This is not an indication of something to be comfortable about. You have to have, be vigilant and to know that this is just this has happened before and led to nothing. I've seen people on leftist Twitter talk about how there was in the election of a socialist mayor in the 80s and ultimately it didn't lead to anything. You need to ultimately, what is working here is not going to be the model everywhere, but also more importantly is a lot of policies that work, there's only limitations of what you can say, you're doing socialism in the likes of a city. However, no, I do wonder, given that New York is such a place that is desirable for people to live in, so many people want to move to New York. It just has so much cultural cachet. There is, I wonder if there's the same risk of capital flight that there would be with other cities, in imposing the type of policies to combat wealth inequality, to make the city more affordable, to ultimately crack down on landlords and lower rents, even restrict the amount of properties people are allowed to own, right? It's another thing you could do to prevent kind of hoarding of properties and accumulate wealth inequality. I don't think if you were to do that, there would be the same level of risk of just all capital just leaving the country in the way that, and leaving the city in the way that there would be for a lot of other cities. Because it's why when New York City gets away with having high income tax rates to begin with, it's because it's what are you going to do? Are you going to leave? the thing about New York is so many people want to live there anyway. And I do wonder if that actually gives some more opportunity, at least when it comes to other cities, on these sort of policies. I want to get back to childcare just after, because I have like a massive critique of that, of like that mentality too. And I think that's actually where I agree with you most here on your critique of that whole, like, how that's become a thing for the left. But first on just like this question, because I know you've talked a lot about capital mobility being a limitation at nation level, and it's kind of definitely a limitation at a city level, because, it's even easier for companies to go from city to city. But I mean, it's New York. It's the apple pie, right?
Yeah, certainly that helps New York a bit. Its size, its historical, centeredness in terms of the financial system. But I do think that one of the things we've been seeing for quite some time now is southern states, especially Florida and Texas, picking off gradually businesses which used to operate in New York or California. It has not been an outright flight. We're not seeing the total collapse of California or New York, but there has been a continuous drip of population and jobs and investment toward those southern states that have no state income tax and stuff like that. I think the more immediate issue that they're likely to face is the state government, which will potentially revoke autonomy if they do things which really tick off wealthy people in the city. Those wealthy people, before they would move, they would go to their wards locally, and they would go to the state government in Albany, and they would look to get those parts of the state of New York and the city of New York to turn on the mayor and start restricting his behavior. I think that's what we're most likely to see. We have seen, it's very common, state governments in the United States revoking powers that cities have when cities start to use those powers in ways that would seem to be potentially getting real results. So what a lot of people will do is they'll look around and they'll say, well, it looks like you could try this policy, you could try that policy. Insofar as the policy actually does really impose a burden upon the rich, not only can the rich leave, but before they leave, they can use their voices to try to get the state or even the assemblyman to turn on the mayor and restrict the mayor's autonomy and capacity to move. And I think that that's what we're most likely to see in cases where they really try to push the envelope. That doesn't mean that they won't, if they win, be able to do anything. I think free buses is not that hard to do. My concern is selling out for free buses to the point where you delude an entire generation about a strategy that will take them 10 or 20 years to get over.
But I mean, even at the level of just making the city more affordable, like at the level of rent, is that not something you could do? And if you were to do that, could that also give inspiration to other cities to pursue similar policies, or even, policies federally? In that, if those policies become popular, it could be easier for a candidate, at the federal presidential level to campaign on those sort of policies.
And he can immediately try to prevent, and he can prevent for some time, rises in rent for the part of the New York City housing stock that's rent controlled. He can do that. Of course, if he does that, past a certain point, a couple of things might happen. One is that the people who own those buildings might sell them to large conglomerates because they might get to a stage where they're not able to sustain owning those properties given the rent and the inflation that's occurred over the last 5 years or so. So you may see a further concentration of the ownership of the New York housing stock as a consequence of the policy. You might also see an effort to revoke from the mayor of New York the right to rent control housing. And that could happen through the state of New York. So those are some of the things we might see. Now, maybe those kinds of fights would be to some degree politically generative. I know a lot of people who are fans of the let's use a mayor strategy think that a showdown between a mayor and a state government could produce broad public sympathy for the mayor that might lead ultimately to further electoral victories. But I don't know that we're going to see that. I haven't seen that successfully done. And to be honest, I think that rent control is not ultimately going to be successful because there is a serious limit on the quantity of housing stock in high prime metropolitan areas. There are certain geographic limitations that we're running into. And this strategy, which goes back to Obama of trying to concentrate economic growth in big metropolitan coastal cities, has a certain limit to it. And part of what we need as a country is a more geographically diverse growth strategy that includes more regions of the country and reduces the amount of pressure on people to move to New York or the Bay Area or Los Angeles. And doubling down on that, just trying to cram more and more people into these cities. I think it's an infrastructure nightmare. There's going to be major problems with raising enough money to support it ultimately. And so what are you likely to get? You're likely to get a situation where there's rent control for those apartments which are still subject to rent control, but the rest of the housing market doesn't do very well. And then there's a possibility of the fact that the rest of the housing market isn't doing very well being used to justify and legitimate the destruction of rent control. So what we could see
You mean
is
the
that,
housing market as in just property values going down?
I mean that there won't be
Or just low
a
supply?
sufficient housing stock of affordable housing in New York for people because the rent controlled section of the New York housing is too finite.
But that's a problem now.
Well,
I mean,
right.
wealthy
But
like
that would
that.
be
Wealthy
that problem. That problem would double down. Well, this would be the problem for the ordinary New York voter. So you're talking about, will people look at this as a
that's
model
what I
and go,
mean.
let's
That's what I mean.
try
But
this
that's
at scale.
precisely why wealthy people would probably not take issue. Like they'd probably like it if there was a lack of supply of housing. I mean, in Canada, this has been the problem: is there's a kind of artificial scarcity of housing, and they benefit from that. So it's like,
Well, then there might be a
you do
reason
that
for them to
accidentally.
tolerate the use of the rent control in that case. The difficult thing about trying to use rent control to solve the New York housing problem is that too small a percentage of the total stock of the housing is rent control. So it leaves you with a large section of people who are left out of the rain. They don't get the benefit of the policy. And then those people can be persuaded by the right that the rent control is the reason that the housing stock is not being increased in scale and size. When really, the real reason that the housing stock in New York never increases is that there's a finite amount of space in New York. There are a lot of infrastructure commitments that have already been made in New York. It's very costly politically and economically to raise the money necessary to eminent domain people and reorganize things. It's not easy to build more housing in incredibly densely populated metropoles. It's not. And even if you deregulate it, what that means is you get into more situations where you have housing which is inappropriate to the infrastructure that you've built.
Yeah, so that would be you're responding there to the abundance advocates, because the abundance advocates are simultaneously pro like some kind of like lefty coded social democratic policies, but also like deregulation as a way to open up areas that are capable of housing being built. I mean, look, there's people have been making this point about Vancouver. Vancouver is a case where there's actually tons of space to build, yet it has like incredibly expensive housing. And I mean, a big part of it that's simultaneously true, but also often a veil, has been, environmental restrictions, is to like not build. And I mean, to some extent, I'm sure that there exists some restrictions that probably don't need to be there to allow for building. I mean, look, I would prefer public housing, but this is New York. New York raising money, a city raising money for these kind of projects is a serious concern.
Yeah, this is a city which is already like 5 different cities all right next to each other. Now, this is a city which is already enormously heavily grown. And it's a city which spills into other cities. It's a city which, you cross the Hudson River, it's Jersey City. It's a whole different city, but it's a continuation of the same enormous buildup of people and population. There's not a ton of room. And you already have significant travel times to get from one end of this city to the center or to the other end. At a certain point, it stops making so much sense to just grow these megacities as much as humanly possible. But this has been the strategy. There's no intention of delivering a wider kind of shared prosperity. So you have cities like Detroit
Well, I mean,
that
he's
are
mayor of New York,
languishing.
and he can't like do that. He
Of
can't
course,
reverse
of
the
course,
process of uneven development, which is,
of course.
inherent to capitalism
I wouldn't
itself.
expect him to. I wouldn't want people to have an expectation or to have a level of excitement that would seem to only be justifiable if you really thought that he could solve real problems that people face. Because if he doesn't actually solve the housing crisis, if he doesn't actually solve the cost of living crisis in New York, then he's just going to look like another bogged down mayor. And, maybe he'll be well liked because of some smaller policies like, a busing policy or something. And maybe his approval rating will still be decent like the mayor in Boston. But these people are talking about him like he is a model for how to rebuild a socialist left in the United States on the strength of beating some of the most corrupt and ineffective politicians in the country, barely by a small margin.
Do people really think that, though, in terms of like a model? Because I mean, like, the reason why I think many were surprised he won is precisely because he's not exactly demographically the most primed as a candidate. I mean, he's Muslim and brown, which puts you at a huge disadvantage in the likes of America. Or anywhere really where the Muslims aren't a majority.
There's such an obsession with that. Americans don't care particularly much about all of that. What they really care about is, does it seem like this person has a credible plan to make my life better? And if you actually seem to have a credible plan to improve somebody's life, you have a track record of success, you've done other things in your life that illustrate that you're competent, you know what you're doing, Americans will give a lot of different kinds of people a chance. There's this
I do think the
stereotype of Americans as very racist or very prejudicial. That's not my experience of the country. And I think it's an attitude that is often used to explain electoral defeat, to say that the Americans are bigots and they just won't support somebody because they're a woman or they're brown or their religion. I don't think that's really true. I think it's that these people have not demonstrated a track record of success. And for a long time, people have observed that their lives have gotten worse, whether they vote for people who make these kinds of promises or don't.
I mean, I agree with you on the racism point, in that America is actually one of the least racist places in the world, if you really look at it in terms of, compared to the likes of Europe, in terms of how culturally, ethnically diverse America is, especially New York is, right? But I mean, the Muslim thing I do think is relevant because of the 9/11 and the whole Islamophobia that inspired. I think that's actually way bigger effect than him being brown. Like, look,
we got halal carts all over the place. People in New York are always buying food from halal carts.
Look. Well, I think, and this is why I think like him winning in New York is like it's not as big of a deal as if he won in a city that was much less ethnically diverse. But the thing about like the Islam stuff, I mean, it definitely is like a barrier. I mean, it was notoriously a barrier for the NDP leader of Canada, who was a Sikh. I mean, not being of a minority religion is going to demographically put you at an advantage, even if you're American as apple pie. Like, I mean, Obama was probably like the most American, president. Just like he's, in terms of how he sounds and speaks, American as apple pie. Yet, the Barack Hussein Obama, that was like constantly used against him.
They try that stuff, but it's not very effective. They think it's effective, and there's a whole part of the trouble is that a lot of the, you have this professional class element, what I call the DeSantis wing of the Republican Party, which imagines that its base is a lot more racist than it is. And so thinks that it accomplishes something with that kind of language. But I really don't think very much is accomplished by that kind of stuff.
I don't know. I think American support for Israel is partially, there's a large part of that's driven by Islamophobia. Like this whole idea that, you have this civilized country of Israel against the barbarians of the Eastern Muslim world. I mean, that plays into like manufacturing support for Israel. Like, it's because whereas if you were to frame it like we're supporting a Jewish state, I don't know if the level of support would be quite the same across the board for Israel among Americans. But if you frame it as the democracy, the civilized democracy against the uncivilized Muslims, Judeo-Christian values.
I don't think about ordinary Americans. There's a crazy level of support or opposition. Most Americans don't care that much about foreign policy unless it makes a direct effect on their life. There's, of course, some parts of the population that are university educated that love to debate foreign policy questions all the time for fun. But that's not most Americans. Most Americans don't care that much about Israel or Palestine and have never cared that much about Israel or Palestine.
No, I
Didn't care
agree.
that much about Israel or Egypt back in the 70s.
Right, but that's also like not caring is itself a position, because if what was happening to Palestinians was happening to a Christian group, a Christian white group, I have a feeling that the amount of, especially in a country that was aligned with the US, the rate at which Americans would care about it would probably be higher, and that's just natural. And that like there's cultural similarity there. That's not even, I don't even view that as like, that is not even just racism in the kind of unusual sense. That's just like people are generally going to be more empathetic to people who they look more like. I think that's not crazy to say. Like, that's why Europeans take in Ukrainians, fine, Ukrainian refugees, but any Muslim refugees, they freak out about because they're culturally different.
Oh my God, they freaked out about the Poles back in the 2000s when the Eastern Europeans were admitted to the European Union. There was a total freak out in Western Europe about large numbers of economic migrants streaming in from Poland. Loads of horrible racist language thrown up in the immigration debate with regard to Poles. No. Really, it's a question of whether people think it will affect their life. People in Western Europe thought that Polish migration would affect them economically, so they cared about it. There isn't a whole lot of concern among ordinary Americans from a huge swathe of foreign policy issues that most people who go to college think are important. And if you look at the polling, if you look at what are the important issues to you polling, at no point has any of these foreign policy issues polled very high in the absence of a U.S. troop deployment. Doesn't matter where in the world it is. The issue is if there's going to be U.S. troops deployed. And if you're going to have a continuing threat to the lives of people that you know, then people really will care and the situation really changes. But it's not like if you polled Americans in the 90s, what are the most important issues facing the country? The Yugoslav war would not have polled particularly high. But there was incredible stuff going on in Yugoslavia during that time. But it was
I agree with all this
issue to the public.
I agree with all this, but the point I'm just making is that him being Muslim is not exactly a strength. That is, I think, less important as to the issue I want to really get at. I know I said we have till 3, but like I think we'll do the backroom segment on. I want to do it on abundance. The Ezra Klein thing. We can do that another day, but right now I think just while we can kind of finish this discussion, I do have till 3:30. So
okay.
Where I think you're totally spot on about people caring about what affects their lives. Okay. Because I do think there is definitely there is just colorism is real, but at the end of the day, what do people care most about? What affects them? And, something relevant to this debate is immigration. And one thing where I do agree with you is I actually think a lot of illegal immigration sentiment is actually anti-legal immigration sentiment, not just anti-immigration, not like anti-immigrant. And I think that's, relevant to another event that's happening, which is the LA's protests over migration. And we talked about this, but it's like, because I've heard people talk about it. Like, what do you think about this protest? And I've knew people who were, went to the protest. There's one person who told me they got beat up by cops. And I'm thinking out of all the things to protest the Trump administration on, I don't know, I could be proven wrong on this, but the immigration issue it's always seemed to me actually immigration is the one thing where he genuinely has popularity on the anti-illegal immigration issue. And it's not just pure xenophobia. It's because look at if there's news about Home Depot is getting raided by ICE so that they don't have illegal migrant workers. I mean, you can say it's bad in terms of humanitarian policy. It is, and it is very humane, the way in which it is absolutely horrible, the way illegal immigrants are treated. But you can't look at the position of you're a worker in Home Depot and you're made to compete with people who are illegal immigrants on the labor market. Your wages are suppressed due to that competition in labor. And, there being less legal immigrants does have a very obvious kind of, benefit on their wages. So it's not like it's not unclear why someone would support that kind of thing from a non-xenophobic point of view. So it's, and also like I think illegal immigration is actually bad, but the people we should blame are the capitalists hiring them, not like punishing just like the poor people trying to cross the border for a better life. But what do you have to say on that?
I think there's a lack of understanding of what the substance of the Trump administration's immigration strategy is. The Trump administration has not been able to vote through some major funding increase to the budget of ICE. It does not have a huge amount of additional resources available to it for enforcing the immigration law. So what the Trump administration does is it tries to make the resources it has go further by trying to generate very viral news stories of its raids and brutal behavior. So what it does is it tries to make examples out of particular high-profile people like Hassan Piker, or it tries to, really, really suggest that if you come to the United States, something terrible might happen, like you might get sent to a prison in El Salvador. And then it uses its opponents to distribute these stories. So it treats a small number of people outrageously, and then its opponents go, "Oh my God, this is happening everywhere." And they suggest there are things like concentration camps in the country or something, and take it way, way big. What this does is it creates a narrative in other countries, in other parts of the world, that the Americans really are treating immigrants that badly and doing it at scale. And so as a consequence, fewer people come to the United States. It deters them from trying to come. So what has happened is that they have not managed to get the deportation rate up relative to the Biden period, let alone the first term Obama, when the number of people being deported every year was insane. It was, I think, 400,000 a year. But what they have done is they have greatly reduced the border crossing rate by creating a climate of fear around the enforcement, which then deters people from coming. And so what I think a lot of people don't realize is that by claiming that the administration is engaging in this very brutal stuff, and sometimes exaggerating the scale on which the administration is operating, they are helping the administration convince people in other parts of the world not to come to the United States. And so they are helping the goal of the program, which is to get immigrants to self-deport or to choose not to come in the first place. So to create an environment where immigrants make the decision to leave or to not come on their own without a formal deportation having to take place. Their aim is to create an environment, a climate of fear around the enforcement that greatly exceeds the actual capacities. So the opponents are really strengthening this strategy by convincing people all over the world that the United States is a much more dangerous place for them than it really is.
It seems to be working, because I hear like Canadians all the time are talking about, I'm scared to go to the US. What if I get arrested? And I'm telling you, like, these are like educated, like people that's just saying this kind of stuff. It's insane heresy. I mean, because I'm a dual citizen, I go to the US all the time, and I hear people tell me like, be careful. Like,
yeah,
this is like this is legal migration. And like, people are taking at certain public figures to getting it inspected as like this is some kind of unprecedented thing. I mean, I don't know. Like, I've had my relatives would get random security checked all the time on airports, and I mean, like, this is not unprecedented fucking policy. Like, I know it's different, the airport thing, but like, it does seem to work, that like the climate of fear this has produced. But in terms of numbers, correct me if I'm wrong, like, hasn't Trump like failed to even surpass Obama's deportation numbers?
He's trailing, last I checked, he's trailing Biden the last year of the Biden administration, behind the curve on that. So let alone, Biden was deporting, I think, around 200,000 a year, maybe 150. And Obama was up to over 400. So their goal is to get start with 1 million and then try to get to 20 million, they said. They'll be hard pressed to get 1 million in a 4-year period. To get 1 million in a 4-year period, you got to get 250 a year. which is a little bit more than half of what Obama was getting per year. But, those are robust numbers compared to what we've recently seen. The strategy has been effective because the opposition has assisted so much in disseminating the narrative that the administration wants put out there, which I think is a tragedy. I firmly support struggling on behalf of the rights of those who have been mistreated in the legal system, in the judiciary. That does not mean that this ought to be the core of the opposition messaging. That's not strategic. Indeed, it's helping the administration to prosecute the policy because the administration does not have the money. They're trying to cut taxes to perpetuate their tax cut. They don't have the fiscal capacity to enforce the immigration law on the scale that they claim they'd like to enforce it at. And they're not willing to raise the tax revenue that would be necessary to do that. They're trying to pass a bill which will deprive them of the funds they would need to actually enforce the law to the scale that they claim that they'd like to enforce it. So when people allow themselves to get worked up by the messaging that the administration is engaging in, it does not ultimately help.
I mean, yeah, I don't know what the whole funding thing, you already know I probably why I disagree on that. But like at the level of capacity, I think, yeah, I mean, to actually like fully get rid of all illegal migrants, you just need to like basically have everyone have like half the population in Los Angeles, collaborate with ICE or something, because it's just, how do you enforce that? Like
you have to hire so many additional people. You need a lot of resources. You can't cut taxes and increase to the degree that they would need to the immigration enforcement capacity. What they're trying to do in physical terms does not make any sense. And once you see that, the bluff is called. If they were really serious,
well, I think they could
have a different fiscal approach.
They could if they have the people willing to join ICE. That's the thing, because I mean, with the military, that's not a constraint. At the federal level, it's never been a constraint for them. But the extent of like, I just think practicality. Like, how do you actually go and find all these people without creating a basically like a totalitarian state?
Well,
like
that's what I mean. You need investigative resources. I'm not just talking about guys to show up to your door when somebody makes a report. I'm talking about the resources needed to actually get good, reliable information on the basis of which you can act.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it is. So like how I felt about the protest is kind of how you feel about Zohan's victory, except very differently. In that, like, I guess with the protest, I found immediately I was just kind of disenchanted that this was the cause that the left is going to champion. And not that it's not morally right. It's just like, generally, like when it comes to fighting battles that you fight battles you can actually win, where it doesn't make your opposition stronger. And in this case, it seems like it does. And that's because like there's still a culture of the left, which is protesting is part of a broader identity and a cachet. It's like cachet to be arrested by police. It's cachet to, be photographed protesting. And I think like, okay, I mean, but what are you actually like trying to accomplish out of this? Because I mean, like with these, and people talk about LA protests. There's a lot of people which want to draw these comparisons to the LA riots. And the efficacy of that was kind of also, that was far bigger and over.
And the scale of that, if you haven't done this, look up, to anybody listening, the number of people killed or injured in the LA riots, in the Rodney King riots in the 90s, and compare that to the stuff that we've been hearing recently. We're really not talking about anything like the same scale of activity or event. Like we're talking orders of magnitude difference. Completely different kind of event, but covered by the media as if it were the same.
I guess with the little time we have left, I want to discuss the childcare thing you brought up, because you felt disillusioned with this being a policy solution the left is known for proposing. And I have to say, I wholeheartedly agree with that. And somebody who made a critique of this among leftists even far back before was Christopher Lasch in Culture and Narcissism, is that he was really critical of the left embracing certain policies that actually kind of accelerate or accommodate issues capitalism is creating, rather than actually like provide a solution to it. And one of those things is literally the welfare state. I mean, people forget how critical, like, a lot of leftists used to be of the welfare state, like, Frankfurt School, for a reason. Not because they supported neoliberalism and having people left on the street, but because, like, is this all the solution? Is to, like, you have the decline of the family, and the solution is what? To, outsource parenting to teachers and social workers? I mean, what does that do to human individuals? Like, what does that do to, like, the raising of children who would definitely benefit from having parents and a community? And it's like, the problem is like, okay, I won't get into the whole abolish the family nonsense stuff, but, like, even from the standpoint of there is, like, I understand there is a reasonable critique of the nuclear family, and that I view the nuclear family as, like, what Marx was saying when he was critiquing it was it's a symptom of the decline of the family itself. Not that he wants to go further and abolish it more, but that the nuclear family is a regression from the community, like a more isolating way of having families as opposed to broader communities. Like, you should feel safe having your kid being taken care of by your neighbor when you need to go do something. Can't do that in a kind of the societies we're in where, there isn't that level of social ties. So yeah, nuclear families very isolating, but even that's totally declined with, like, people don't even have time to be there for their kids, absentee parenting. And, like, the solution is what? Just to, like, have social workers do all the work. And I mean, it makes me wonder because, if you actually ask family abolitionist types what they want, they either think they'll be magically community when capitalism is overthrown, which is a hypothesis, not a fact, or two, that they kind of implicitly think that, like, we'll somehow, like, take care of each other, everybody, which a lot of people who are critical of that position immediately think, okay, so the state. And sure, in theory, that's might be communalistic, because the Soviet Union did do stuff like this, by the way, in its early days before abandoning it very quickly. I mean, Mao's China experimented with these sort of policies. It used to be a communist position, briefly, right? This collectivization of child rearing, but you quickly find that when you try to collectivize child rearing or outsource it beyond just the immediate parents, it doesn't actually work unless it's within a community that has pre-established social ties. And that doesn't exist with social workers and random kids. So it's just like, I don't know what else to say on that.
Yeah, the commodifying of parenting. This idea that you can buy love is ridiculous. This idea that love is something that can be handled through a transaction is ridiculous. Of course, there's all sorts of issues with a restrictive kind of family model that prohibits deviation. There's lots of different ways to produce people in loving environments that give them capabilities and capacities. I'm not arguing there's only one way to do it, but I can tell you that if you think that hiring mercenaries to watch after your children while you're not around, if you think that's going to make your kids feel loved, know what love is, be capable of showing love to other people, this is a badly delusive kind of situation. Badly delusive situation. And you hear these people and they say, well, people don't want to have to watch their kids. They don't want to. They don't desire to. Having children is a social role that you take on that you can't give up once you take it on. It's a permanent, lifelong commitment. And it changes who you are and what you can be, especially in this kind of society where there's very limited help from other people who actually love your kids. And that really is the core of it. Are the people who are helping you taking care of your children, are they actually people who love your kids? Do they love them? If they don't love them, you're creating a situation where people are going to confuse the way that somebody who's been paid to treat them treats them with the way somebody who loves them treats them. You're making a situation where people can't tell the difference between a transactional relationship and a relationship that's based on viewing the other as an end in itself or as somebody valuable for their own sake. Putting this confusion into children at an early age. And what? Because it's convenient. Or because there doesn't seem to be any other way to pay the bills. This is such an easy off-ramp. When People have to look after their children because otherwise it would be irresponsible. And they know that. And they act on that basis. And when your employer asks you to take hours that are not compatible with that, you join together with other people to put up a fight. But if we tell each other that mercenary parents can do just as good for kids as people who love them can, or maybe better because they've been trained by somebody to be good daycare providers, which is an argument I've heard a few times now. Very sick argument. This is just, we're crossing into an incredibly dystopian terrain. And it really frustrates me that the left and so many people that I know who were part of the Bernie Sanders thing don't understand that there's a problem with commodifying these kinds of relationships. Don't understand, and not just to the point where they tolerate this as a policy, but where they put it up front and center, like this is the reason to support a candidate. This is the reason. To get excited, I'm supposed to smile and make you feel good about the world today because this is what somebody proposes to do. And if I don't do this, then I'm a killjoy. The mandatory positivity of all of this. Yeah. Can't we at least have the freedom to feel different ways about it? Can we have that at least? My God.
I guess, it's just the bar has been lowered for what is considered, anything that will help people with anything. And having subsidized daycare sounds more progressive than having nothing, And it's the kind of thing that I think it's accommodationist problem. It is an accommodationist policy. And I think really what we should be striving for is a reduction in the working day and working week. Time energy, which, we're both big proponents of as a kind of thing to prioritize as part of a politics. I think that is like the key thing is, actually having the people's biological parents have the time to be there. There's so many ways in which the problem is baked in beyond just like having time to have kids or being able to have kids. Because all of childcare, what it does do is it allows you to actually it makes the process more affordable, but it doesn't change the fact that there's this broader trend of absentee parenting. And there's so many little ways in which it's been normalized. Like one of the biggest things that I think we don't talk about enough is one thing that has made absentee parenting a lot easier is video games. Video games and TV. It's like you can really it's so common practice to just be like, okay, I'm not going to talk to my kid for the whole day. Just here's the Xbox. It makes it easier, but it also kind of really, we can't act like, of course, this must have some huge psychological impact on development.
Yeah,
I think it has to do with
people having kids for their own reasons and not because they actually understand what they're doing when they bring somebody into the world. And people not reading to their kids, people not doing the basic things that are necessary to prepare their kids for school so that it can seem like something like a daycare program from the time somebody's 6 months old is the best way to prepare them for school. And we're reaching a point where people say, well, this is how people want to parent. So what, are you just going to get in the way of the kids having the best thing they can have given the situation? And this is the kind of argument we have to listen to these days. It's very sad because we're going to have a whole generation of people who aren't able to do basic things. And this is already something that gets complained about, a less socialized generation that's less able to engage in political action with others. We had this problem throughout the Bernie movement of people who were joining for psychological reasons because they wanted to be seen, because they wanted recognition or love from other people that they didn't get as kids, because they grew up as latchkey kids, they grew up with absentee parents or abusive parents. We had this kind of problem all the time trying to do social and political organizing. We're dealing with people who are coming to the activity for personal reasons that were not really about achieving the political goals. And so they could not be strategic. They were too unwell to be strategic. And now this problem is going to become so much worse, and it's going to become worse with the left cheering for it to be worse. cheering for it to be worse and making excuses for it to become worse the whole way.
I just want to say one thing, because I don't know if you saw, but I had a tweet responding to Fox News outrage over some of Zohran's policies, much of which had to do with making the process of having kids more affordable. Like one of them was like raising wages. One was the free baskets to newborns. The other was free daycare. Now these are like standard like NDP policies in Canada. Standard policies are even Quebec, like the government of Quebec. And look. As a kind of Lashian, okay, I'm well aware that these policies are accommodationist policies, but I found it funny that it's like, Fox News is like freaking out about this and like presenting it to its base as if this is the scariest thing ever. But the thing about the right is that they always talk about the family, but they do nothing to like even address that whatsoever. Very little.
Because the right doesn't trust administration. So the right thinks that if your family is held together on the basis of administration, that it's in some way tainted or corrupt. They don't trust the state to provide education or to socialize children, which is in part why, the homeschooling movement has always been strong on the right and the parochial schools have always been strong on the right. They don't trust state institutions and structures to do this stuff well. So when they hear about it, they go, there's nothing the state can do that can make up for your inability to appropriately run your family, which might be true, but then they have no real alternative plan for how to create a possibility for families because they don't have a critique of capitalism or any kind of strategy for dealing with that.
Well, that's the thing. Like, see, I think it's just better to actually let people who have the kids take care of the kids and have communities that support each other in doing that sort of thing. That's a community, but not like the state, this sort of impersonal bureaucratic relation to facilitate child rearing. I mean, if you look at the world of the world that Brave New World depicts, it's where like kids are like made in test tubes. I mean, if you take the logical conclusion of a policy that wants to maintain the human species, but doesn't actually want to, undo the decline of human bonds that a capitalist mode of production has been continuing, or whatever mode whatever you want to call it, whatever system we have, whatever's happening, the way to artificially maintain the human species would be this sort of like test tube babies. And I mean, it's kind of like a conclusion of like this way to continue like human evolution, but through this very impersonal way and sacrificing a lot of the things that like make humans human.
Yeah, if you shrink
interaction with other humans
down to just consumption and commodity production and consumption, if you shrink it down to that, then it will seem to be possible to maintain human life and human culture well beyond the point at which anything worth defending has been destroyed.
Now, I would like you to just quickly like respond to this point, because I actually get in this conversation with a lot of just regular friends who aren't necessarily like, especially, it's a conversation I always am interested when I hear women's opinion on this. And it's so like, I find myself like a lot of people see the position that I have on the family question as like somewhat conservative or even trad, but I never really saw it that way, which is that basically like I believe in socialist policies that allow to make it easier for people to have families and to build communities. But then what's kind of like a response you often get to that from, I would say, liberal feminist types, and maybe even some parts on the far left, some parts of the far left, where they'll say, well, so you just want like women to be at home and just have kids? You don't want women to be independent? Now, how do you respond to that exactly? Because that is like,
why not you or me? Why can't the dad be home? It used to be that the struggle was to give everybody a choice about this. Now, when you say, "Hey,
well, like, why not both just not be away from home for so long?" Like, I think that's
sure. Reduce it down, to that point, even better. But it used to be that the debate was just, can somebody be home? Can somebody be home? So that when the kid comes home from school, they're not a latchkey kid, as in a kid, who has to unlock the door of their house because they're locked out of their house when they come home because nobody's home. That's what we used to talk about in the 80s and 90s. Yeah. it's not about making women do something in particular. Taking care of children is a perfectly rewarding role for a man, a perfectly rewarding role that men should have the freedom and opportunity to pursue. And what people do is they impute sexism upon anyone who is interested in creating conditions under which human beings can be well brought up. And what would that mean? Capacity to exercise some level of self-restraint, a capacity to defer gratification, the knowledge that you're loved, that you're okay, and therefore you don't have to immediately grab whatever's in front of you right now as a consolation. The human capacity to think and reason is not something that automatically produces itself. The left is meant to create additional human possibilities to make it easier for larger numbers of people to practice higher level human capacities, skills, abilities, to acquire higher level skills and abilities. That is not something that happens automatically through the process of consumption. It's something that has to be carefully strategized with pedagogy, with human associations and organizations of varying types. And there's a plurality of ways of doing it. It's not as if there's only one correct way. But when you destroy the conditions under which any of these modes can operate, and you create a situation where from cradle to grave, all you do is produce and consume, there's a lot of human capacities and potentialities that are left on the table. And we get to a point where not only do we fail to extend these capacities and potentialities to the working class and to the poor, but the rich lose them. And the rich become just as bad. And
yeah, because they're just time energy
deprived. Yeah.
Because they're time energy
they just
deprived.
become, all they do is try to make money, and they don't actually live life. And then they try to make up for it by drinking bubbly on the boat or whatever it is that they do.
Which is probably when we might start
loss.
to see, probably honestly, when we might start to see any kind of changes when like enough of the elite also, this becomes a problem for them. I think who's going to be the next revolutionary class is the mentally fucked up class of, or strata of children of very rich parents. Now, whether that's a good or bad thing, I mean, is irrelevant. But I think that's very possible. That's another debate in itself, just because it's something I've noticed. Like if you look at the generation of like wealthy kids, the kids of very wealthy individuals, if you even compare like the types of things they do compared to the generations before, it says a lot about society. I mean, look at like just Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau's dad, born rich, kind of like semi-aristocrat, well-educated, became Renaissance man, traveled the world, became prime minister. Justin Trudeau, drama teacher, noticeably less intelligent than his father was in terms of like knowledge, speaking ability, charisma, a bunch. But then his son, I mean, who knows? His son might like become, he might have a transformation. He's very young, but he's like a rapper. I don't know. It's just kind of funny. Like it's just reflective of a broader phenomenon I've seen, which is like children of rich parents basically kind of embracing sort of like types of careers you wouldn't expect to, but almost as a way of like being like, fuck this.
There are reasons to not have fun all the time, because when you have fun all the time, you never gain the human capacities and skills necessary to effectively struggle to improve anything for anybody. And if we make the workers unable to act, we kill the possibility of socialism. If we construct workers who don't have the basic capacities, qualities, skills necessary for action, you kill the possibility of socialism. And you could say, oh, I'm helping parents by giving them free childcare. You're destroying the capacities of the next generation. What a non-reformist reform does, insofar as these are possible, and I do believe that they are, is that it generates conditions under which the next generation can think better and act better than the previous generation. What makes this kind of reform so disgusting is that it not only fails to do that, it's not only, bread and circuses even, it's not even just something that fobs people off, it degenerates the capacities of the next generation. It makes the next generation worse. So, I wouldn't mind a little bread and circuses here and there. It's one thing to give people a treat. It's another thing to give them something that's toxic to the future of the movement, actively degenerative and toxic. But we have lost any ability really to recognize that there are capacities that we need and that these have to be generated, in part because of this tendency to treat any discussion of human capabilities, qualities, virtues as right-coded or right-wing, or as in some way defending the family or some other structure you're supposed to hate. And as a consequence of this, we are actively participating in the degeneration of human beings and their qualities and skills.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I have to say, sometimes the impotence of the right will allow me to be a little too defensive of the left, even though from the perspective of a lot of leftists, I'm way too critical of the left. In fact, it's the source of probably the most negative comments I get. But yeah, I mean, nothing else to add. It was a great episode, very depressing episode. But in the back room, we're going to talk about a less depressing, but probably also kind of depressing, but also very interesting debate. Is this whole abundance thing? Everyone's talking about abundance and Ezra Klein, and I'm almost done actually reading the book. I haven't finished it, so perhaps anyway, we'll talk about that as usual. Thanks for listening to the show. If you're not part of the back room already, if you like listening to this, you get double that by becoming a patron for just $5. Very simple. See you there.
See you there.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.